This is part 2 of Sidney Huntington's story. If you haven't seen part 1, check out the link in the description to watch how it all began. For a century, Sidney Huntington thrived in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. While others perished in the cold, he mastered survival. Raised along the Koyukuk River, he learned to live off the land the way his Athapascan ancestors had for generations. Hunting, trapping, fishing. Every skill meant the difference between life and death. But his greatest battles weren't just against the Alaskan wilderness. Through loss, hardship, and even a struggle with alcoholism, Huntington's story isn't just about survival. It's about resilience, tradition, and the changing world of Alaska's native people. How did Sidney Huntington endure 100 years in the unforgiving Alaskan frontier? And what wisdom did he leave behind? The campfire is ready, so stay with me tonight. The story is about to start. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Chapter 15. The Old Koyukon Ways. I developed an early interest in my Koyukon roots and in the culture and history of the Koyukon people. With first-hand experience living from the land, I gained an appreciation for the abilities of my forebears who had survived in the Koyukuk country without rifles, modern traps, fishing nets, modern tools, processed foods, and ready-made clothing. Interior Alaska's Athapascans were the last of Alaska's natives to come into contact with white men when the Russian Creole Malakoff built a blockhouse at Nulato in 1839. Creole was a term used by Alaska's early Russians for those of Russian and native ancestry. Malakoff found that the Koyukon people had iron pots, glass beads, cloth, and tobacco that had reached them through trade with coastal Eskimos. From Nulato, fur-seeking Russian traders traveled up the Yukon to the mouth of the Tanana River. The Athapascans they found were eager to obtain blankets, axes, knives, muzzle-loading rifles, powder horns, lead balls, kettles, and files. They didn't care much for the clothing offered by early Russians and Hudson's Bay Company traders, who arrived at Fort Yukon in 1847, because their own skin clothing was superior in warmth, durability, and appearance. In 1866, the explorer William Dell wrote, "The Koyukons are the most attractive in appearance of the Indians in this part of the territory. The women do up their hair in 2 braids, one on each side." The original dress of the male Koyukons consists of a pair of breeches of deerskin with moccasins attached and a deerskin parka without any hood, long and pointed, before and behind. They are fond of ornaments and gay colors. Another early writer said that in winter the trousers of the Athapascans along the Yukon were of fur. Mittens and a hood or fur cap were also worn in winter. The clothing was often decorated with dentalium shell, a trade item from coastal Alaska, or porcupine quills. After white contact, trade beads were commonly used for decoration. Change came swiftly to the Koyukon people after arrival of the Russians, and swift change has continued to this day. Edwin Simon, born in 1898, considered that he lived 3 lives in his 81 years. His first life, until 1930, was mostly primitive by today's standards and basically the same as that of his parents. He used birch bark canoes and poling boats for river travel. Candles provided light. Dogs pulled his sled as well as his poling boat while he poled or paddled. He carried a muzzle-loading rifle, bow and arrows, and an axe. Wherever the family stopped to live for a time, they built a sod igloo, or house. Igloo is an Eskimo word borrowed by the Koyukons. It means house. By digging about 4 feet underground, the house would be half below ground level. With the axe, they cut poles and sod for walls and roof. A fire burned in the center of the floor, and smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. The family moved frequently to where they could most easily catch fish in traps they built, or where they could shoot game. Much of their clothing was made of animal skins. As an adult, Edwin once asked his mother, "What did you do with all your things when you traveled all the time?" "What things?" she replied. "We had nothing. A rifle, bow and arrow, 1 axe, and the clothes we wore. We didn't leave anything behind. In his second life, from 1930 to 1960, Edwin owned a gasoline-powered boat with an inboard engine. He used oil and white gas for lamps and lanterns. He wore manufactured clothing, roamed less, and lived in log houses. He was not entirely dependent on wild game and fish for food because food could be purchased at trading posts. In his third life, 1960 to 1979, he enjoyed electricity and running water in his permanent log home. He owned a snow machine, a three-wheel all-terrain vehicle, a refrigerator, a freezer, and a radio. He fished and hunted game for food, mostly within easy traveling distance of home. Many of the old ways of the Koyukon are entirely gone. Others are disappearing. Even the skills of hunting, trapping, and fishing in the old way are changing, altered or eliminated by outboard motors, scope-sighted rifles, and snow machines. As a boy, I admired the knowledge and abilities of many of the Koyukon elders, and I loved listening to their stories of the past. I learned from them that during the 1800s, the Koyukuk Valley was poorer in fish and game than other areas in Alaska. In contrast, the Yukon River, with its great runs of salmon, was considered a paradise. At the time, if you didn't kill, you didn't eat. The people's very existence depended on fish and game, and they hunted and or fished year-round. They didn't farm or grow crops. They harvested some berries and dried fish that they caught, but when they had to make long treks to go where game and fish were more abundant, they could carry only a limited amount of such food. The following is a story told to me by Chief Henry, 1883 to 1976, who had learned it from his grandfather. He believed it was based on an actual event. Chief Henry was famous for his storytelling, songs, and philosophy of life. For me, it illustrates how precarious the lives of the Koyukon people were in the old days. Times were hard in the Koyukuk River Valley in the 1820s and 1830s, with virtually no game and no fish. There were no moose. The Koyukon people had overfished the streams and lakes. They had blocked some of the streams with fish traps for too many consecutive years, wiping out returns of salmon to the Koyukuk River. Dulby Slough and Dulby River were the last two streams that still supported salmon runs. It has only been in modern times that the Koyukon people have been aware of the life history of salmon, that the tiny fish, which hatch from eggs buried in the gravel of a stream, travel downriver to the sea, where they mature so they can return to the very stream of their birth. Most of the Indians left the Koyukuk River to search for a place where they could find fish and game. Many moved to the Yukon River, where they knew they could catch and dry enough salmon during summer to last through winter. Some of the Koyukon families that remained in the Koyukuk River Valley starved to death, still hoping that fish would arrive. They could have moved to the fish-rich Yukon River with other families, but they had gambled and lost. 4 springs passed. The people who had moved longed for their Koyukuk country homes. They decided that by this time the caribou would have returned to their old home. The rabbits, long gone, should be returning now, too. With such thoughts, despite warnings of the elders who doubted that fish and game had returned in such a short time, some of the people left the security of the Yukon River and returned to Hog River. Fall set in. At Hog River, the fish traps that blocked the streams produced very few fish, not enough to see the people through the winter. In those days of famine, the Indians moved on their own legs, pulling a sled to carry only what they needed for existence. There were no dogs to pull sleds because there was no food for the dogs. With starvation near, some of the men went hunting in the nearby hills and mountains. They were away many weeks. Finally, in January, as days were beginning to lengthen, some of the men returned. Others did not. Perhaps they had starved to death. Those who came back had found caribou a long way off in the headwaters of the Melozitna River. They brought with them some meat, but not enough to feed everyone. They had cached meat along the way, planning to eat it for strength as they returned with their families to the Melozitna headwaters, where they had left their main meat cache. A young man who had qualified for a woman the previous year returned home from this long hunt. He found his wife with a baby boy born just after he had left. The young father found his family hard-pressed for food. His mother, especially, was weak. Food she could have eaten she had given to her daughter-in-law, the mother of the newborn baby. Slowly but surely, she was starving herself to death, giving away her life's energy so her only grandson might live. Everyone in the camp hurriedly prepared for the long move to the Melozitna, except for the old grandmother. "I cannot go, my son," she said. "I do not have enough strength." "I will pull you in my sled. You raised me well. I cannot leave you behind to die," the son promised. The mother did not speak for a long time. Finally she called to him and his woman and asked them to listen to her. As she spoke, she cradled her grandson in her arms. "Son, I am old now. I worked hard all of my life to raise you. We have had hard times for too many years. I raised you properly even after your father starved to death. We kept going. I can do no more. But even while I die, I am going to help you. Without me, you and your young wife and baby boy might survive. With me along, you would not survive. The trail is too long and hard for me to walk. Pulling me on the sled would take all of your strength. You must listen to me. Use your head, not just your eyes, to cry. Be a brave man, not the kind of brave that it takes to kill big animals. You must be braver than that to make me happy, and to let your wife and son perhaps live a longer life. I am sure they will not live long if you do not do what I ask you to do. I took good care of you. Now you owe me. Show me how brave you are. I will not go with you, and you must not leave me here to slowly starve and freeze to death." Understanding what his mother had told him, he sadly left the igloo. He went to the leader, the medicine man of their little tribe, and told him what his mother had said. The leader explained to the young man that this had happened before. "She is right. Big animals are easier to take than the life of the woman who brought you into this world. I watched your mother raise you. She did a good job. She is still trying in her last hours to help you. You must be strong and brave. If you do not do what she asks of you, you will slowly put to death your young wife and your only baby. I know you are strong. You are not going to do something you have to hide from or be ashamed of. You will be doing something to make your mother happy, the mother who worked so hard to raise you, the mother who is still looking out for you. Are you brave enough to do this?" The young man and his wife spent a sleepless night. If they were to survive, they must join the trek to the meat cache on the morrow. Early in the morning, after the young man and his wife had loaded everything in their sled, the mother walked out of her igloo with a coil of rawhide rope. She moved steadily toward a birch tree at the side of the trail. She put one end of the rope over a branch of the tree, sat down, and put a loop over her head and around her neck. Then she faced away from the trail and called, "I am ready, my son." He pulled on the rawhide rope. All of the Koyukon elders know this story, but as one old woman told me, we can't tell such stories because it is against our beliefs to tell these stories to others. For this reason, many of the oral traditions of the Koyukon people are being lost. Many stories I have heard from Koyukon elders illustrate that all thoughts and energies were aimed at survival. After about 1850, when rifles and shotguns were available, starvation largely ended for Alaska's Athapaskans. I caught a glimpse of how difficult early Indian life was from Johnny Oldman, a Koyukon elder. In 1934, he was 72 and I was 19. Just before Christmas that year, my brother Jimmy and I left Hog River with Johnny, his son Abraham, and a 4-year-old girl. With 2 dog teams, we headed for Hughes, where the potlatch for Little William was to be held. Little William had made the snowshoes for me when I was a child. Temperatures were -50 degrees and colder during the day, and even colder at night. Jimmy and I helped to break trail for the 2 sleds, which were loaded with bear and moose meat for the potlatch. The little girl was bundled up in one of the sleds. On the second day out, near dark, when we crossed a creek in the bottom of a valley, the thermometer on my sled registered -68 degrees. "Leave the meat, go to the top of the ridge, and make camp. Put up the tent, Johnny Oldman instructed Jimmy and me. "It'll be warmer there." As Johnny had predicted, the temperature was warmer on the ridge, only minus 52 degrees. Jimmy and I put up the tent, set up the wood stove, and quickly built a fire. The stove heated the tent rapidly. When Johnny and Abraham arrived, Johnny suggested that Jimmy, Abraham, and I return to haul the meat out of the valley that night to save time the next day. When we arrived back at camp with the meat, Johnny had finished cooking dog food, and our supper was ready. The mercury in my thermometer was now almost down to minus 60 degrees. When we got inside the tent, we found the little girl inside, naked, her skin blue from cold. She had wet her clothes during the long day of riding the sled, and Johnny had hung them over the stove to dry. Feeling sorry for the poor girl, I started to wrap her in my spare long johns. "Don't do that, Sidney," Johnny said. "It's not really cold. She has to get tough. A long time ago, Indians had to be tough to live. That's why a long time ago, our people were strong. Only the tough boys and girls survived. The weak, the sick, and the crippled died. If we wrap up those kids all the time, how are they going to grow up to be tough?" 12 years later, when Johnny Oldman was 84, Edwin Simon and I visited him at the Alaska Native Service Hospital at Tanana. Things weren't looking good for Johnny. He was in a bed in a small ward. His thinning hair was gray, and age wrinkles lined his face. His gentle brown eyes sparkled with intelligence, but he was thin and frail. He had little time left. I talked with a nurse who cared for him. She complained, "His skin has to be at least half an inch thick." She usually bent the needle of her hypodermic syringe while trying to force it through the thick skin of Johnny's buttocks. Johnny had spent most of his life out in the cold. I guess his body reacted by developing a thick, tough skin. The only way she could make the needle penetrate was to ram it hard. Sometimes she bent the needle, pulled it out, and tried again. Many Alaska natives were coming to the hospital for treatment. "You know, Sidney, too bad, but I can see the days of the good, strong, healthy Indian coming to an end," Johnny said sadly. "How's that, Johnny?" He spoke slowly in a weak voice. "Sidney, I'm almost at the end of my life, and I am ready to go. I have lived a good, clean life. I know I did right in my life. You even show me that by coming to visit me before I die. I like to thank you for coming. You see all these people come here from all over Alaska? Many are very young. Even young women come to have baby. Young people these days are sickly. You can see they are not going to live long. Only medicine keep them alive. Now look at me. That medicine don't help me because I'm stronger than the medicine they got. People are not strong anymore. Not long ago, only the strong ones lived. They raise all the weak ones now, what we call misfits. How can the good, strong Indians last when they breed with weak people? People used to be born from two strong, healthy parents who survived to grow up when things were tough, when nothing came easy. Koyukuk. Indians were strong then. No more, Sidney. No more strong Indians, he said sadly, slowly shaking his head. Johnny Oldman died soon after our visit. Although Alaska has a national reputation as a region of abundant wildlife, it is a poor land when compared with almost any other state on the basis of pounds of game produced per acre. The Koyukuk Valley, which straddles the Arctic Circle, with its short growing season and harsh winters, produces few pounds of meat, in the form of wildlife, per acre. Small wonder that the early Koyukon people perpetually wandered, always looking for places where there were game and fish in abundance. Chief Henry told me of years when little or no game was available, which meant little food and no new clothing for the people, often for long periods. People saved their good winter clothing for cold weather because with everyday use the fur wore off, leaving nothing but leather to protect from the cold. That's what we called being poor, he told me. Women made all clothing from skins. There were no mosquito nets or insect repellents. Smoke was the only way to escape these pests, and during summer every family had to keep smudges burning. One early Athapascan technique to escape mosquitoes while canoeing was to place a dish of wet moss or a piece of bracket fungi with a few hot coals in the bow of a canoe. When the canoe was in motion, the smoke surrounded the paddlers and discouraged insects. Matches were not available, and there were few or no metal tools, no steel traps or snares. And all medicines came from plants. Braggarts were looked down upon by the early Koyukon people, and hunters went to extremes to present a modest front. A hunter who had killed 2 large moose might return to the village and say, "I finally caught 2 calves," to give no hint of bragging. Chief Henry and other elders believed that all animals have personalities, and they treated them accordingly when shooting, trapping, or snaring them. If you didn't treat an animal properly, its spirit was offended, then that animal would refuse to be caught in your snares or traps. These beliefs and values still linger among many of the Koyukon people. At one time, there were Koyukon songs that honored each and every species of wildlife. A few people still know some of those songs. No old-time Koyukon would laugh at an animal or speak disparagingly of it. They believed that you had to be careful in talking about the animals so as not to offend. You never said you were going hunting. You were just going for a walk or for a ride in your canoe to see the country. In this way, you didn't let the animals know your intentions. Even after killing an animal, the Koyukons had certain ceremonial obligations. For example, a hunter or trapper carrying a wolverine home would sing something like, "A rich person, or a chief, is coming to the house." A good blanket was spread on the floor next to a wall of the house or of a tent, and the wolverine was placed in a sitting position, its back propped against the wall. Each person who visited the house placed a small food item near the wolverine. The wolverine was to be well treated and not offended in any way. A small piece of dried fish or other food would be placed in the mouth of a fox, a marten, or other small game, and grease or lard was smeared over the nostrils so the animal would not be offended by the smell of the inside of the house. Wolverine and wolf carcasses were burned, not simply discarded or buried. Unused brown grizzly bear meat and other parts were buried or burned to destroy the spirit. Beaver and otter bones were returned to the water with a request to make more of those animals. You never would point your finger at an animal to indicate where it was, because he would feel your finger pointing at him and walk away. A wolf in a trap might be spoken to. "Wolf, I ask that more of you come to my traps," and only then would it be killed. Any trapped animal was killed as quickly as possible to reduce suffering, and trapped animals were always treated with respect. Spirits of birds were also catered to. A hunter might say that he had bothered some ptarmigan when he had hunted them, indicating that he had inconvenienced the birds. When talking about hunting or trapping, people might say, "I am going to hunt for nothing," to not offend any animal by specific mention. They believed that one should always sound humble toward animals. Being too confident and acting as if shooting or trapping animals were easy wouldn't show proper respect. If you behaved respectfully, animals would allow themselves to be caught in your trap or shot by your gun. Hunting provided not only meat for early Indians, but also clothing, bedding, tents, rope, string, sinew for sewing, and bones for making tools and needles. Caribou bones are the hardest and make the best scrapers and other tools. Caribou skin makes the warmest winter parkas, pants, boots, and mittens, but the animals have to be killed when the hair is just the right length. To obtain good caribou skins for clothing, early Koyukon hunters traveled 50 to 100 miles or more to the hills and mountains seeking fawns in late July and early August. Some year-old caribou were killed, but their skins made clothing of only fair quality. Nothing could beat the quality of fawn skins. When taken at that time of year, the hair of fawn skins is strong. It doesn't break off and shed, as does the hair of older caribou. Also, the leather, as light and as soft as chamois skin, can be worn against the skin. "How did the people keep warm in winter?" I once asked Chief Henry. "You never keep warm," he replied. "We had to be tough and use a good head and watch ourselves." When Chief Henry was very young, his family moved from the Koyukuk River to the Yukon to fish for salmon because salmon had stopped coming to the Koyukuk. He said his parents saw famine coming, and their medicine man told them to move. "You must not stay in one place too long. When you do, You kill all the fish. There is no game to eat. You must not take a chance and get caught at freeze-up in the wrong place where there are no fish, he warned. Winter was the critical time to the Koyukons. The deep snow, the extended periods of extreme cold, the iced-over rivers, the few hours of daylight, all make life difficult in the far north. The regular winter home of the early Koyukon people, the half-buried sod house, must have been dank and dark, even with a fire burning most of the time. When the Koyukon people camped out or needed temporary winter homes, they erected a teepee-like igloo made of spruce poles and insulated with moss. A fire in the center of the floor was likely to create a smoky interior, but you could sleep on the floor under the smoke where it was warm. According to old-timer Louis Golchick, you could even sleep without blankets if a fire burned. I once visited Golchick's comfortable spruce pole igloo. It was dark, but it was warm, roomy, and comfortable. At times, the early Indians had to ration fish. Even the skins of fish were saved, for they were valuable as food. In some years, the cyclic snowshoe hare was important food. This creature, which is brown in summer and white in winter, literally floats on loose snow because of its huge feet. Roughly every 10 years, it becomes abundant in some places, and the lynx, foxes, marten, wolverine, and owls feast. In the old days, so did the Koyukon people, for the hare is easily snared, and the food is good, although it has virtually no fat. Rabbit skin is fragile, easily torn, so the people used to cut it into long strips, which they wove into blankets and sometimes clothing. The spirit of the snowshoe hare was considered to be rather weak. Nevertheless, people would break the legs of hares when they brought them inside to cut up, keeping their spirits from running around loose. When hares suddenly erupted in great numbers, Koyukon elders explained that the winter white animals had fallen from the sky with the snow. No matter how clever or careful the Koyukon people were, they sometimes got caught without food. If they didn't migrate soon enough, starvation was not uncommon. To be effective, moves away from the Koyukuk had to be made across the last crust of the spring snow. Wearing snowshoes, they moved swiftly, making it possible for them to reach the Yukon in time to build a fish trap before the summer runs of salmon began. Salmon were regarded as lifesavers. The Koyukon people usually eventually returned to their Koyukuk Valley home, commonly after years of living on the Yukon. When the whites arrived, they brought flour, valuable for mixing with other foods, meat, fish, skin, to make gravy. Flour stretched what little food the Indians had. When caribou were scarce, meat was dried until it crumbled, and then it was mixed with flour and water to stretch it to the maximum. The coming of whites and the fur trade, which was long Alaska's economic mainstay, also brought a new type of economy to Alaska's natives. Their subsistence economy was converted to a trade economy in which store clothes and white man's food replaced skin garments and, in part, the food derived from the hunt, fish traps, and the trapline. Gradually, periodic moves by the Koyukon people seeking better hunting and fishing grounds ceased because supplies were available from traders. By 1900, a trading post could be found in most of the larger native villages along the Yukon and Koyukuk rivers. During the last half of the 20th century, more and more villages came into existence, and the perpetual wandering of the people ceased. Schools, churches, and permanent year-round homes were built, and a new way of life was set for the Koyukon people. Chapter 16. Siwash. When I was 13 years old, I became aware of prejudice against half-breeds. At Nulato, I had joined a soccer game in progress on the mission playground. Suddenly, one of the kids on the opposition team poked his face into mine and sneered, "You half-breed Siwash." I continued to play, not realizing that the boy had intended an insult. "What's the matter with you, Sidney? Are you afraid of him?" a friend asked. "Number why?" "Didn't you hear him call you a half-breed Siwash?" "Yeah, what's that mean?" I asked. "Those are awful dirty words to call you. He wants to fight you, I think." I ran to the guy and asked, "What did you call me?" "Half-breed Siwash," he answered with a mocking look. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "Don't you know that means you're a dirty coward?" I understood dirty coward all right. He immediately had a fight on his hands, even though he was a couple of years older. I had had plenty of practice fighting at a Klutna school, so I gave him more than he had bargained for. Other boys started to come to his rescue, but Father Mac, the Catholic priest who had been watching the game, held them off, allowing me to finish the job. When the kid had had enough, I let him up from the ground. "What happened, Sidney?" "You don't look for trouble?" Father Mac asked. I told him what the boy had called me, that I hadn't understood half-breed Siwash as fighting words. "But," I told Father Mac, "I understood dirty coward, and I was only trying to accommodate him." "I'm sure he understands that now," said Father Mac, with a barely repressed smile. My dad, who in 1897 toiled his way over Chilkoot Pass into the Klondike gold fields, claimed that Indians around Skagway were called Siwashes. He thought it was a tribal name. As he traveled into the headwaters of the Yukon River, he saw more Indians. "What Indians are those?" he asked another gold rusher. "Oh, they're Siwashes," was the answer. The next step to lazy Siwashes, or damn Siwashes, came easy. When something was stolen, even if a white man was the thief, some low-down Siwash took it. To the Athapascan Indians along the Yukon and Koyukuk rivers, by the 1920s and 30s, the term certainly had a negative connotation. Call someone a Siwash and you had an instant fight on your hands. It was even more of an insult than son of a bitch was among whites. At Koyukuk, an Indian once called me a son of a bitch, and I lit into him with both fists. He backed off, claiming I was fighting him for no reason. "I only called you a son of a bitch," he explained. As stampeders from the Klondike Gold Rush moved down the Yukon River, Siwash became more degrading. I've seen terrible fights among Indians who were careless how they used the word. My dictionary says that Siwash comes from Chinook jargon. In the Columbia River country, Chinook was a lingua franca, with its root the French sauvage, meaning wild or savage. One definition is to camp, live, or do things after the manner of an Indian, especially to travel without equipment. Siwashing out is a commonly used term in Alaska and elsewhere for tough camping with minimal gear. It probably came from the reputation, deserved or not, that Indians, Siwashes, have for being able to survive in the woods under extreme conditions. Some folks' version of Siwashing out is pretty tame compared with real Siwashing. I have known many Koyukon people who often Siwashed out when conditions were really tough, people like my uncles Weasel Heart and Hog River Johnny, Edwin Simon, Johnny Oldman, and others. Most of them later in life paid a heavy price for exposure to extremes. As they grew older, arthritis or rheumatism crippled them with constant pain. Many modern Alaskans consider sleeping out under the open skies, even in a $300 down-filled sleeping bag, as Siwashing out, but that's the easy way. In my younger years, Koyukon elders told me to avoid Siwashing out, unless I had no choice. "Only when you are all played out, or lost," Edwin Simon warned. I made up my mind that I would never Siwash out, but of course I couldn't avoid getting caught a few times. Edwin told me what to do if I had to Siwash out during winter when all I had with me was the clothing I wore and an axe. His words probably saved my life. One night in early February 1935, when I was a tough 19-year-old, I learned about Siwashing firsthand in the Hog River country behind Sun Mountain. I frequently ran Martin down, but I often got into trouble in doing so. Interested in establishing a new Martin trapline, I decided to scout new country. I left my Clear Creek camp on Hog River about 4:30 in the morning and drove my dog team to the foothills, where I tied them. It was breaking daylight when I put on snowshoes and set out to search the hills. Snow was deep, but none had fallen for several days. If Martin were around, I knew I would see their tracks, made since the previous snowfall. I soon found good sign with Martin tracks here and there. I toured among the big hills and covered many miles. Late in the day, I ran into a fresh marten track. To test its freshness, I slid the head of my axe into the snow under the track and tried to lift it. Disturbed snow sets after a time, and an old track remains intact when lifted with an axe in that manner. This track crumpled, which indicated that it was fresh. The marten was traveling in the opposite direction I wanted to go, but I didn't worry about that. Part of the satisfaction of the trapline was the excitement I felt when on a fresh trail. But sometimes I would forget to be smart. I forgot the dog team I had left tied. I forgot that I had traveled hard all day. I forgot that darkness was near. I forgot that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I took off on a run, snowshoes flying, following the fresh track over a ridge and down into a steep valley, thinking I would catch him quickly. His tracks, instead of meandering with short leaps, changed to a straight line with large leaps, so he knew he was being trailed. Finding no big trees to climb, he ran faster. Floundering in the deep snow in that steep-sided valley, I slowed my pace, but continued to follow him along the creek. The chase lasted about an hour. Finally, after several miles, I caught up with him. He treed, and I shot him with my .22. His fine pelt was worth about $20, big money in 1935, when a good day's wage was about $5. Within a few hours, that $20 seemed like small potatoes. When one makes his first mistake in the woods, other mistakes usually follow. When I had left my cabin on Clear Creek more than 12 hours earlier, the temperature had been minus 34 degrees, with no wind, a fine temperature for traveling. Until the marten chase, I'd remained comfortable because I was properly dressed and kept moving. The marten chase had made my clothing damp with sweat, and damp clothing combined with cold is a lethal mixture. Rather than climb the steep slope, I decided to head down the valley, which seemed to turn in the direction of my dog team. I walked for about an hour, left the creek where the bank wasn't so steep, and climbed out of the valley. Both darkness and cold deepened. Reaching the top of the ridge, I decided to follow it out, expecting to intersect my snowshoe track at any time. I was growing very tired, and darkness under the heavy spruce timber made it difficult for me to see any distance. I came to an open place, but I didn't see anything that looked familiar. I crossed the ridge into a new valley, scanning the snow as I went, searching for my own tracks. The snow seemed deeper, and the cold more intense. I was dog-tired. I decided to build a fire, rest, and dry my damp wool underwear, for I could feel the penetrating cold sapping my strength. With my axe, the most important survival tool in wooded country, I cut dry wood and started a fire atop the snow. The heat felt good, and I could feel the moisture leaving my underwear. The flames quickly thawed a hole in the snow that eventually became more than 4 feet deep. Using a snowshoe for a shovel, I dug in around the edge, away from the fire, following it down. I wasn't thinking of Siwashing out, only drying off. I dozed in front of the fire. Then I remembered Edwin's warning. Look out if you get sleepy. Go to sleep, and you can fall into the fire. You can be burned so badly you can't do anything, and then you will die. Take care of yourself before you let yourself fall asleep. I roused myself, suddenly realizing that I was going to have to Siwash it for the night. I cut a few larger trees, some green boughs, and 3 and 4 inch diameter dry poles. Soon I had a large pile of wood. I built up my original fire. By this time it had melted its way to bare ground. I placed the green spruce boughs near the fire, where they thawed, dried, and warmed, ready for later use. Then, using my snowshoes, I dug a second hole in the snow for another fire, near my original fire, which by now was burning down. I scooped all the hot coals and partly burned wood from the first fire and placed them on my new fire, and then I piled wood high on the new fire. I laid my supply of now dry green spruce branches over the spot where the first fire had burned. Steam arose from under the branches, for the ground was still hot. I remembered Edwin's instructions. Lie down with your parka over you for a blanket, and you'll get 2, maybe 3 hours sleep. When the cold wakens you, the other fire should just be going out. Edwin also said I would be stiff all over, but rested. Everything proved to be true to the last detail. When I lay down on my pile of green spruce boughs with my parka on top of me, the warmth from the heated ground felt heavenly. I was asleep in moments. When I awoke, I was rested, but no more heat was rising from the ground beneath me, and the cold was beginning to penetrate. My muscles were so stiff that I could hardly get the kinks out. The damp steam seemed to have settled in my joints. My second fire was nearly out, but by piling dry wood on the coals, I soon had the flames leaping high. I huddled near the life-giving heat and thoroughly dried my clothing, damp from the steaming ground. I waited for daylight before moving on, for I knew I was lost. With the first faint light, I worked my way high on a ridge in search of a landmark. As I peered across country, I discovered that after killing the marten, I had walked toward the Koyukuk River, away from Hog River, where I had left my dog team. I spent almost that entire day hiking back to my dog team and driving the dogs back to my cabin. After 36 hours without food, the dogs and I were ravenous. Based on that experience, I did my best to avoid having to Siwash out during winter again. Do I get upset nowadays if someone calls me a half-breed Siwash? I haven't let anything like that bother me for years. Besides, I can always look anyone who does straight in the eye and say, "You're absolutely right, friend. Now what's your background?" Chapter 17. Koyukuk Gold. Because of the Depression, during the early 1930s, a silver dollar looked as big as a full moon in October. Fur prices were low and we saw little cash, but we continued to live as trappers and from the land. Despite the tough times, we were happy and lived well. Dad's health continued to grow poorer. In 1934, he left his job at Nulato and entered the Alaska Pioneers' Home at Sitka. After a year there, his health had slightly improved, and he was restless. When I was 18, I spent much time at Koyukuk Station, where a girl named Jenny Luke lived. We were married in 1934 when I was 19, and we lived at Hog River. Jimmy lived with us for a year after we were married. In 1936, Jimmy married Celia Olin at Cutoff, about 80 river miles from Hog River, and he lived most of the time in that Koyukuk River village, close to her family. During some winters, he returned to trap with me at Hog River. After he had been in the Pioneers' Home for a little over a year, Dad wrote to Jimmy and me, "Whether I die lazing around the Pioneers' Home or digging for gold in the Koyukuk makes little difference. I might as well be doing something, so I've decided to try digging for gold at Bear Creek." Trapping, freighting, and trading were only sidelines as far as Dad was concerned. Gold was what he came north for, and the search for it continued to be his passion. He had faith in the Koyukuk gold fields, and with good reason. From 1900 to 1930, about $5 million worth of gold came out of the Koyukuk, mostly from the headwaters area, 75 miles upstream from Bettles. Bear Creek, about 40 miles northwest of Hughes, a headwater tributary to Hog River, is one of Alaska's 60 Bear Creeks. Gold was found there in the 1920s and earlier by Dominic Vernetti and others, but not in large amounts. Most of the area surrounding Bear Creek is permafrost, permanently frozen ground, but Bear Creek ground is wet, not frozen, with only a few spots of permafrost. Permafrost forms when the average annual temperature is below freezing, and in some of the colder regions of the Arctic, permafrost is hundreds of feet deep. Because of the wet ground at Bear Creek, early miners couldn't sink a hole to bedrock where the gold lies without being what they called drowned out. Dominic Vernetti and Ernie McLeod and a couple of others managed to take $2,000 worth of gold out of a frozen pit at Bear Creek before being drowned out. After that, Ernie McLeod worked at Bear Creek for years, trying unsuccessfully to develop a way of mining the area before he was starved out. But Dad was convinced Bear Creek was worth another try. "No one has mined Bear Creek right," he said. "If we can get down to bedrock and prove gold is there, we can either sell out or mine it ourselves." So in January 1935, Jimmy and I headed across country to Bear Creek with our dog teams and built Dad a fine 12 by 16 cabin out of dry spruce logs. We put up a good roof, digging under the snow for sod to insulate it, and we mudded the walls to eliminate drafts and installed a good window and a door. At the time, I had a wife and was starting a family. Jimmy was busy trapping and had no money. Financing a mining venture was out of the question for us, but we could help some. We took Dad to the cabin and left him there more or less on his own, and hauled food and other supplies to him periodically. Bear Creek wasn't far from the end of one of my trap lines, so I checked on him every few days. Dad staked claims for himself and for friends and small investors who had provided him with power of attorney. Then he gradually froze a prospect hole down into the wet ground. First he dug down 3 or 4 feet, chipping away the frozen ground, making a hole about 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. When he got down about 5 feet, he chipped out the frozen earth, filled a bucket, climbed the ladder out of the hole, winched the bucket up, and dumped the spoil. That he did again and again. The process was slow and strenuous for a 68-year-old in poor health. When he reached wet ground, he sometimes waited days for it to freeze. Then he dug a test hole to see how far down it was frozen. When he was sure 6 or 8 inches had frozen, he chipped out the frozen ground, leaving a frozen crust thick enough to prevent groundwater from entering. Each week he dug down another 6 inches or so, and eventually his hole was almost 11 feet deep. One day when he dug out some frozen dirt, he noticed dampness. He figured it would freeze, since the temperature was around -30 degrees. But the next morning he found the hole almost full of water. The wet spot had given way. Dad had been drowned out, like all the others. 2 months or more of hard, patient work had been destroyed overnight. He didn't say much about it, but I knew he was bitterly disappointed. He didn't live long enough to know that he had dug to within 1.5 feet of bedrock and millions of dollars worth of gold. That summer he sold partnership shares in the ground he had staked. His various partners were all mining people, and they arranged for the United Smelting and Refining Company to drill prospect holes, with an option to lease or buy. Shortly after that, Dad died at Fairbanks. I went to work for the mining company in 1937. We flew the first drill to Bear Creek in a small plane, and then a little D4 Caterpillar was driven in. While I worked at 79 cents an hour to help set up the drill and to move it around, my wife, Jenny, lived with our kids in a log cabin at the mouth of nearby Clear Creek. That winter I saw good fur sign, so I quit the mining company and went trapping. I went back one day to visit the drill crew. They fed me and were cordial. Then one of the men told me, "Sidney, your dad would turn over in his grave if he knew what we have found." They had drilled a prospect hole next to Dad's 11-foot deep hole. In the bottom of their 6-inch diameter hole, they had panned $16 worth of gold. Later, when a dredge was brought in, more than $3 million in gold came from that one claim alone. After drilling, the exploration company acted on their option and bought all the claims. For our inherited shares, Jimmy and I each received $15,000, a fortune to us. Almost 20 years later, in 1955, a gold mining dredge was brought, piecemeal, up the Koyukuk River. I worked as a foreman, clearing the road that ran 28 miles from the river back to the mining camp. In the fall and winter, when the ground was firmly frozen, we hauled in the dredge parts and reassembled this machine-filled floating behemoth, a floating building that could be dragged along, scooping up the gold-laden earth. The buckets it swung could pull gravel to the surface from as much as 60 feet below ground level. At the site, we had big caterpillars and graders, pile-driving equipment, and other heavy machinery. I was paid well, $600 a month, plus room and board, so I worked there a year. But I missed my wife and kids. One of my jobs was to use a surveyor's transit to lay out a 7-mile ditch for bringing water to the dredge. I had to follow contour lines through the hills so the water fell at a maximum rate of about 1/2 inch per 100 feet. At the end, the water dropped straight down for 142 feet, providing pressure for a hydraulic nozzle. Since I was self-taught as a surveyor, I enjoyed this challenging job. Later, the company engineer resurveyed my ditch and found that I was off only 1/2 inch in the 7 miles. I also helped to run the dredge. One day, the man who was panning on the dredge quit. "Sidney, would you mind panning for a while?" a supervisor asked. We'll leave your salary at $600 a month." I agreed, but reluctantly. The panner, who pans a sample of the dredged-up material every 20 minutes or so, guides the dredge all day. He judges which direction the dredge should travel, and the dredge master follows his instructions. Until then, with the work I was doing, I had been able to get out of the noisy contraption from time to time. The gold came in steadily as I panned during that first day. On hand were 9 buckets of pure gold, each weighing between 90 and 100 pounds. When I removed the mercury amalgam with a retort outside of the dredge, the gold looked just like butter. Until then, working the dredge on Dad's claims hadn't bothered me, not even the one where he had been drowned out. But as I panned the gleaming yellow stuff, I suddenly realized that all that gold I was seeing had been my dad's. I was making others rich with Huntington gold. I put the pan down, found the foreman, and said, "Call Sam White for me." I'm leaving. Sam White had left his job as game warden and was the Wien Airlines bush pilot at Hughes. "What's wrong, Sidney?" he asked. "I'll tell you some other time. I have to leave. I have no gold on me." They were careful to make sure that people leaving the dredge carried no gold. To my knowledge, $20 million worth of gold came from the Bear Creek claims on which Dad filed. I never returned to the dredge. Chapter 18. Sled Dogs. 1. May Day in 1937, Jenny and I drove our dog team up Clear Creek. The dogs pulled a 12-foot basket sled equipped with a G-pole. Wearing skis, I straddled the tow line and guided the sled through the deep snow with the G-pole, a spruce pole that projected from the front of the sled. Jenny was pregnant and rode on the rear of the sled. We started to cross a deep gully, and as we pitched down the steep cut bank, Jenny stepped on the brake, a simple hinged claw on the rear of the sled. But the brake didn't catch, and the heavy sled picked up speed and got out of control. The rear end whipped around and threw Jenny clear across the gully onto the opposite bank, and she sustained serious internal injuries. I put Jenny on the sled and drove her back to our Hog River cabin. Leaving her there, I drove several miles to my Uncle Hog River Johnny's place, found his wife Molly at home, and brought her back to nurse Jenny. I waited for a day, but Jenny didn't improve. She was in considerable pain, and Molly advised that I get her to the hospital. "I've never taken care of anyone hurt like this," Molly said. Jenny was in no condition to ride a dog sled to the hospital. I had to get an airplane. The nearest plane was at Koyukuk Station, so early the next morning I took off from Hog River with my 8 dogs. My leader was Dockley, a lovely animal with upstanding pointed ears and a beautiful gray coat. She resembled a wolf. I've never had a better leader. That day, that grand dog team averaged more than 10 miles an hour for the 120 miles from Hog River to Koyukuk. Those dogs loved to run, happily carrying their tails high, their feet pattered on the hard trail, steam puffing from their mouths, with the sled runners singing their song, a song that changed pitch with speed and with changes in the trail. That evening, I found bush pilot Herman Lerdahl at John Evans's store. "How much will you charge to fly Jenny from Hog River to the hospital at Tanana?" I asked. "I don't have much money, but I have some marten skins, and I think I can get some cash." "I'll help Sidney with money if he needs it," John Evans said. "Okay, I'll fly her tomorrow," Herman said. "You can pay me when I come back." The next morning he flew his Curtiss Robin on skis to Hog River, picked Jenny up, and flew her to the Native Service Hospital at Tanana. He said that the doctors thought that Jenny would be all right and that she wouldn't lose the baby. So the following day I harnessed the team and mushed back to Hog River, arriving before dark. I waited a few days, but Jenny's condition worried me, so I drove the dogs to Cutoff, and I called the hospital on the village radio. News was good. Jenny was doing well. Much relieved, I headed my dog team home. Traveling in the cool of the evening on crusted snow, we came to the steep bank of the Koyukuk River and headed down. The surface was rough where mud had frozen. I stepped on the brake claw caught, the brake stick broke, and the sled rolled. I tried to stop the rolling, but the bank was very steep and the dogs were moving fast. I was tossed into the ice-filled river. The swift, frigid water constricted my chest so I could hardly breathe as I frantically splashed shoreward. The dogs continued on their way. The weight and bulk of my wolfskin parka and heavy clothing dragged me down as I was swept downstream. Soon the current pushed me against the ice's edge along the river. Breakup was near, and the ice was candling and caving in. I couldn't touch bottom, and the rushing current kept pushing my legs downstream as I clung to the rotten ice. I had discarded my mittens when I hit the water, and my bare fingers soon became torn and raw from clinging to the ice. I struggled to pull my knife out of its sheath on my belt, then jammed the blade into a crack in the ice. Carefully, I started to pull myself up onto the weak ice by the knife handle. I was nearly out of the water when the knife broke. I plunged back into the numbing water, exhausted. I thought I was going to die, for the cold had penetrated my body, and it was difficult for me to move. Even thinking was difficult. Realizing I had one chance left, I tried again. I lifted one leg onto the ice. My boot caught, and I inched my way up. I lay on the ice for a moment, half in the water, half on the ice, too weak to pull myself any farther. My hands were numb and bleeding, and the blood made them slippery. Gripping the ice was almost impossible. Finding some tiny holes, I jammed my hands into them and pulled myself closer to shore. I don't know how long I lay stretched on the creaking ice, trying to gain strength. Finally, drawing a deep breath, I pulled myself upward and forward a few more inches. Alternately resting and pulling, I worked my entire body out of the water and onto the ice. I couldn't move for a time. Then, keenly aware of the instability of the spring ice, I began wriggling toward shore. Stubbornly, I crawled across that rotten ice toward the riverbank. I don't know how long I struggled to reach the muddy beach, but by the time I got there, my energy was spent. I passed out or slept, I'm not sure which, soaking wet, numb, chilled to the bone. I recovered consciousness with Dockley and a few of my other dogs licking my face. They had returned for me. Amazed by behavior so unusual for a dog team, I lifted my head and discovered the sled was still intact, although battered from bouncing on its side. Infused with new hope, I stood up. With my dogs clustered around me, I staggered to the sled. Happily, my gear was still lashed inside. With badly cut hands that were clumsy and numb, I opened the waterproof bag. This was one time when my habit of traveling with extra clothing on the sled paid off. Struggling to get out of my wet things, I discovered my legs were badly cut and bleeding from the sharp ice. I had been too numb to feel the cuts. I put on dry long johns, pants, and shirt, and I was grateful for the warmth of wool. Not having enough strength to ride the runners, I sat in the sled's basket and headed the dogs home. I watched the trail, calling G, right, and Haw, left, to Dockley. She promptly responded to every command. If she hadn't, I wasn't sure I could cope with climbing out of the sled to push if we bogged down in soft snow. I saw tracks where the team had run upriver about 5 miles without me. This told me that I had spent about an hour in the water and lying wet in the mud afterward, for that team traveled at about 10 miles an hour. Dockley had turned them around by leading them in a big half circle and had followed the trail back. If she hadn't returned, I would have died. At the cabin, I yanked harnesses off all the dogs and turned them loose. Then I collapsed on the bed. I developed pneumonia, and for weeks breathing was painful and labored. My chest hurt, and I was so weak I could barely move. While I recovered, the dogs were free to come in and out of the cabin. They caused no trouble and took care of themselves. I managed to rouse myself enough to toss them their food, dried fish, every day, and they got water from the river. The dogs often lay close to me when I could scarcely leave the bed. Dockley seemed to understand that her closeness helped, for she spent long hours near me as I slowly gained strength. I remember that great gray dog with much fondness. In the 1920s and 1930s, a 5-dog team was considered large among the Koyukon people. Individual animals then were much larger than the racing sled dogs that became popular in later years. My dogs weighed 60 to 70 pounds, and each could pull 100 pounds for hours at a time when in good condition. Before metal chains were available, Athapaskans had a clever way of keeping their dogs tied. Most dogs would chew through the rawhide ropes used to tie them, so the early people tied a thong of moosehide around the dog's neck and tied the thong through a hole at the flattened end of a light pole. The other end of the 5-foot pole was tied loosely to a tree, so the dog could travel around the tree, but could not reach the leashing. When tied this way, the dog could not cut the thong at its neck or at the tree, nor could it chew the pole itself. Until arrival of dependable airplanes in the 1930s, dog teams provided most of the winter transportation in bush Alaska. The government marked dog team trails and built shelter cabins that were used by all travelers. On major routes, roadhouses, about a day's travel apart, provided food and lodging for man and dog. Early in this century, male teams had perhaps 5 to 8 dogs. By the 1920s and into the 1930s, male teams of up to 25 dogs pulled 1, sometimes 2, huge freight sleds with unbelievable loads. Male team drivers often hauled passengers as well as mail and freight. There was no other form of winter transportation between the far-flung villages of interior and northern Alaska. Each summer, many Yukon River residents dried tons of chum salmon to sell as food for sled dogs. Dog liveries or kennels along the Yukon River and at Fairbanks boarded sled dogs during snow-free months. Many of the dogs used in the Koyukuk and Lower Yukon, including mine, came from stock bred by Ben Derrick, one of the early dog team mail carriers. Reportedly, Derrick saw a wolf frequenting a woodpile across the Yukon River from his place and tied a fine female sled dog nearby for the wolf to breed. He then crossed the half-wolf dogs of the resulting litter with a fine strain of sled dogs. During his breeding program, he even included a large hunting hound. Eventually, he had fine sled dogs that were slightly less than 1/4 wolf. The females of the line were invariably good workers. Some of the males were lazy, but when the males were good, they were very good. The dogs were selectively bred for toughness, heavy coats, gentleness, a willingness to work, and feet that could withstand the rigors of snow and ice. I valued my dogs and gave them good care, keeping them in tight, warm houses. I provided dry grass for winter bedding, cooked for them daily, and made friends with all of them. This sounds like common sense, but not all sled dog owners on the Koyukuk and the Lower Yukon treated their animals this well. Sled dogs are work animals, not pets, and some owners regarded them simply as a means of transport and didn't believe in treating them gently. I have seen teams of dogs so wild and vicious that I feared to be near them. Some dogs are left tied all summer with barely enough food to survive. Even in winter, some dogs receive little attention, except when in harness. Unlike most pet, farm, or hunting breeds known to Americans, sled dogs tend to be aloof and independent. A few wags of the tail may be an emotional response to a master. Nevertheless, sled dogs do respond to good care and affection. My dogs responded to my kindness, and I was fond of them. I believe this is what saved my life when Dockley turned the team and returned to look for me. I once had to take about half a cord of firewood piled on my 12-foot-long basket sled up the Koyukuk River, and my 8 dogs romped along pulling that heavy load as if it were nothing. At cutoff, I needed to take the load up a steep 50-foot bank, and Jack Sackett stood nearby, watching. I stopped the dogs at the riverbank for a rest. I pretended confidence as I prepared to try that climb. I knew I would have to help too. I started cussing, making believe I was angry at the dogs. "Come on, boys, let's go," I yelled. They pulled. I yanked on the tow line, which was stretched so tautly that the hard cotton rope felt like a steel cable. Every one of those wonderful, powerful dogs tensed their muscles and leaned into their harnesses with their bellies right against the snow. The sled started to move, and it continued to slide up and over the top of that steep bank, with me pushing and the dogs pulling for all they were worth. If I had had to bet whether 8 dogs could pull that much weight up such a bank, I'd have bet against them. It didn't seem possible. "I've never seen such strong dogs, Sidney," said Sackett, which was high praise from an old-timer who had lived with sled dogs for half a century or more. For heavy loads, like my load of wood at cutoff, my dogs wore padded work collars, which weigh only a few ounces. On long trips, padded collars are best for heavy loads because they do not cause a rash inside the front legs of the animals like web harness. I have great admiration for a well-trained dog team. I once watched Johnny Oldman with his dog team reach a steep riverbank. He had a heavy load in the sled, and he didn't want to take the dogs and sled down the bank together, so he unsnapped the team and walked them down onto the snow-covered river ice. "Whoa!" he commanded Buster, his leader. Buster stopped, and so did the entire team. Johnny then climbed back up the bank and pushed the sled, which slid down in a rush. Then, rehooking the tow line, he was again ready to travel. The well-trained dogs hadn't moved. Another impressive demonstration of control I saw was by Koyukon George Jimmy. He pushed his tiny 15-pound racing sled into position and, without tying or snubbing it down, and with no one at the brake, stretched his tow line out. George turned his team of 12 high-strung racing dogs loose and called them one at a time to their harnesses. When they were all harnessed and hooked to the tow line, the dogs, eager to run, stood trembling, ready to leap ahead. But they remained steady. As they stood poised, George fussed around, getting organized. He put dog chains in a bag on the sled, tied on his marten skin cap, put on his mittens, and finally stepped onto the runners. Then, at a barely audible sound from his lips, those 12 dogs shot forward like a single bullet. Many of Alaska's finest racing dog teams have come from the Koyukuk and Lower Yukon country. In 1939, my brother Jimmy, in his first try at that race, won 4th place in the annual North American Championship sled dog race at Fairbanks. Sadly, he didn't receive the promised prize money, for the organizers of the race went broke. After that experience, Jimmy lost interest in the big-time races. Then, in 1956, when he was 39, at the urging of a group of Huslia villagers, Jimmy entered sled dog races at Fairbanks and Anchorage. Sled dog racing was then a major sport in Alaska. With 3 of his own dogs and others loaned by me and various friends, Jimmy became the Huslia Hustler, a nickname hung on him by the press. In that one season, he won both the North American Championship at Fairbanks and the All-Alaska Championship at Anchorage, beating about 30 of Alaska's top mushers. He didn't make much money racing dogs, for travel to the big cities plus living expenses ate much of the money he made. But for the rest of his life, he enjoyed the fame he rightly received for his extraordinary achievements in those 2 races. Although I had a fast team, I was raising a family and needed sure money. I knew I could stay home and in a couple of months make $1,500 to $2,000 on my trapline. If I had gone to Fairbanks to race, I might have made $1,000 if I won, but after costs, little profit was likely. So I stayed home and trapped, but many of my dogs raced when I loaned them to Jimmy and other well-known mushers such as Raymond Paul and George Atla. My dogs were always returned with thanks and praise for their performance, and I sold one dog to George Atla, who raced him for a couple of seasons. Later, in the early 1970s, he sold the dog for $1,600, a small price compared with the $4,000 or $5,000 commonly paid today for a top racer. Nowadays, dogs are commonly bred for speed. A team that cannot run 25 miles an hour in a sprint cannot compete in Alaska's sled dog races. Finishing times for 20 and 30-mile courses, such as the 3-day North American Championship, keep getting shorter. My wife Jenny had a way with dogs. I once bought a dog team from Dr. Brafflet, a dentist who practiced his profession from village to village along the Yukon River, hauling his dental equipment in his sled. He had left his practice, and I bought his team for $15 a dog. Most of them weighed around 80 pounds, and they were beautiful animals, but some of them were as wild as wolves. I was nervous about a big yellowish fellow. He growled and bared his teeth whenever I came near. I was intimidated, and he knew it. One day I decided to harness him, so I wore heavy clothing and heavy mittens, fearing he would bite. I unsnapped his chain and pulled him against my knee, and he turned and started biting. Jenny, watching through the cabin window, charged to my rescue. Although she was pregnant, wearing a dress, and was bare-legged and bare-handed, she grabbed that big dog's collar and jerked him to the tow line and slapped a harness on him. The dog cooled right down. Jenny, who weighed no more than 100 pounds, said, "You're scared of him, and he knows it." And she was right. After that, I'd go to him boldly and do exactly what she had done, and he never gave me a problem again. Training and working with a good dog team is a joy. Years later, one fine March day, I took my 5-year-old son, Carl, with me when I left the Hog River cabin to run my trap line. Carl, who was to win the 1,100-mile Anchorage to Nome Iditarod sled dog race in 1974, had begun learning to trap, run dogs, and understand the out-of-doors. I had a tent camp on the trap line, and not far from it we met a pack of wolves. With a lucky shot, I managed to kill one. The others fled. We drove the dog team on through a portage. I stopped to check a trap, tied the sled's snubbing line to a tree, and walked to the trap. While I was gone, the dogs scented a second pack of wolves and grew excited. They lunged and leaped until the snubbing line broke, and away they went with the sled bouncing and flying in their wake. That left Carl and me afoot. I had intended to cover my entire 30 miles of trap line, but without the team, I'd never make it. I couldn't pack Carl that far. Our tent camp was about 8 miles away, so I decided to head in that direction, hoping the dogs would end up there. It was more likely they would tangle the sled, harness, or tow line in trees or brush, or if they happened to catch and fight the wolves, some of the dogs might get chewed up or killed. As I snowshoed along with Carl on my shoulders, I worried about the dogs and was angry and disgusted. After several miles, as I walked along a lake shore, Carl piped up, "Looks like dogs or something coming." Glory be, here came our team trotting around the edge of the lake, pulling the still upright sled. They bounded to us, tails wagging, grinning, happy. They had finished their wolf chase and returned as if it were an everyday occurrence. Immensely pleased with my dogs, I grinned widely as I tucked Carl into the basket of the sled and called, "Come, G, Dockley, come, G." Chapter 19. Beaver. The beaver is one of nature's great gifts. This old dam builder is a wonderful, fascinating animal who brings alive the wildlands. I've spent days watching beaver gnaw down trees, then tow them or gnawed off sections to their dams, lodges, and food piles. Weighing up to 50 pounds, occasionally more, the beaver is unique among the wildefe of the Koyukuk, for in his life's work of building dams, he may create ponds that provide him with a year-round, safe home. In the pond, he builds a large house of branches and mud with underwater entrances, and inside the house, an above-water resting place. All beaver don't build dams and form ponds. Some build houses along banks of rivers. Underwater, near their houses, beaver store tree limbs for winter food. They eat the bark from these limbs. Cottonwood, poplar, and birch are favorites. Because of his fine, durable, warm fur and tasty flesh, the people of the Koyukuk have always made use of the beaver. In pre-white times, the Koyukon people had their own specialized method of harvesting the animal in winter. After that, for about half a century, from the late 1800s until the 1940s, the main method of taking beaver was to shoot them with a rifle. This was wasteful, for many beaver were lost by sinking. Since the 1940s, shooting beaver has been illegal. One spring in the mid-1930s, my brother Jimmy and I decided to hunt beaver on Hog River. This was when Jimmy lived at Cutoff, and I lived at Hog River. We were both in our 20s. We started from Cutoff with 2 teams of 5 dogs each. Our plan was to travel to a point upstream from the Paw River Portage, a trip of 80 miles as the Raven flies, probably 100 miles by dog team. The area is hilly, with mostly spruce and birch timber. We reached Hog River with no difficulty. The snow was still frozen, but each day the temperature neared the thawing mark. After going through the Sun Mountain area and over the hills, travel became difficult. The snow was slushy, and the dogs and loaded sleds sank deeply into it. We camped for the night and set out early the next day to climb a big ridge while the snow was still hard from the night's freeze. The dogs could hardly handle our heavily loaded sleds, and we had to push with all our strength. When we reached the top, I was so hungry I stopped to eat while Jimmy went ahead. I had a couple of bottles of seal oil, traded from a coastal Eskimo, and some old dried salmon. I ignored the moldy tinge of green on the salmon and ate greedily. Along with the moldy fish, I swallowed plenty of seal oil, which tasted good. Jimmy had found a live beaver house and was waiting at it when I caught up. We camped nearby, preparing to start our beaver hunt. As it turned out, I wasn't able to participate in the hunt for a while. Afflicted by diarrhea from my meal, I spent about a day and a half sitting on a big willow branch as the seal oil dripped through me. In the meantime, Jimmy shot a couple of beaver, so we had something decent to eat. When I recovered, I joined in the hunt. I carried a new .25-20, while Jimmy had a .30-30. We used hard-nosed bullets that did little damage to beaver skins. We searched for active beaver lodges where beaver had been leaving the water to feed. We would quietly wait until the animals left the water and then shoot them in the eye or nose. We had to quickly retrieve the animals, for if we didn't move fast, a beaver sometimes kicked itself back under the ice in a death flurry. If we killed 3 or 4 or more in an area distant from camp, we skinned them so we didn't have to carry the heavy carcasses. As we worked our way downstream, the weather warmed. When the snow froze during the night or early morning, we moved as fast as we could before it thawed and turned to slush again. One day we had to cross a deep creek. The ice covering it looked solid, and, though breakup was near, we decided to take a chance. Jimmy had the guns and ammunition on his sled. My heavier sled held food, camping gear, and other items. Jimmy whooped at his dogs, and they sped across the ice. Stopping, he watched while I crossed. "Come on, guys!" I yelled at my dogs, and they followed in Jimmy's tracks. All went well for the first few feet. Suddenly, the ice broke and my sled sank in the swift water. I clung to the submerging sled as pieces of ice flew all about, but I had to turn loose when it rolled in the current. My load spilled and washed away. The only items left were those lashed to the sled with rawhide. Jimmy grabbed my tow line and, with the help of my dogs, pulled me and the sled ashore. I was soaking wet from feet to shoulders. Jimmy started a fire, and I changed into dry clothes from the pack on his sled. The current had swept most of our food out of reach under the ice. We managed to retrieve coffee, but we had no bacon, flour, salt, or sugar. As a result, for a month, we ate mostly beaver meat. Without salt, I didn't like the taste, and eventually I couldn't eat any more beaver. When there was nothing else to eat, I burned the beaver meat thoroughly. Burned beaver tastes better to me than unsalted beaver. Joe Beatus, a Koyukon elder of Cutoff, later told me that I'd have been better off not cooking the meat, that I should have eaten it raw. Maybe he was right. We boiled or burned many geese that we shot and made goose soup. I practically lived on that soup. We brought 60 beaver skins home, and each of us made about $300, not an especially good take. I lost a lot of weight on that trip. My normal weight is about 160 pounds, and when I got home, I weighed about 135. On that trip, Jimmy and I were walking to a lake to look for beaver when we saw a big black bear on a nearby hillside. The bear eyed us, but we ignored him. We had plenty of beaver meat, which we were eating and feeding to the dogs, so we had no need for the bear. Suddenly, without a sound, the bear charged, bounding directly at us. My rifle was over my shoulder, and I started to pull the case off. Jimmy fired, hitting the bear in the heart so that it died instantly, collapsing in mid-stride. It rolled between us while I was still trying to slide the case off of my rifle. Disgusted, I threw the gun case away, and I have never since carried a cased rifle while afield. Beaver, which become very fat, are an important food animal for the Koyukon people. In pre-white times, before traps, snares, rifles, and steel ice chisels, no one trapped beaver beneath the ice, the primary method of taking them today. When a Koyukon hunter of the old ways wanted a beaver in winter, he first located all the extra houses, or hideout houses, that the beaver may use for feeding once ice locks them into pond and lodge. He then cut open all the hideout houses so they froze and became unusable for the beaver. Next, with an axe, he cut a hole through the top of the main lodge, which can be difficult, for frozen mud and sticks of a beaver house are hard as rock and may be a foot or more thick. If the hunter had previously found every hideout house and made them useless to the beaver, he would find all the beaver lying together in the water inside the main lodge. Sometimes their chins would be resting on the platform at waterline, the only place they could surface to breathe. Frequently, the beaver behaved almost as if they were waiting for the hunter to take them. The rest is hard to believe, and I was skeptical before I witnessed it. In 1935, my uncle Weaselheart and his wife Josie told me that I should be ready if I wanted to see them kill all the beaver in a beaver house at a lake about 10 miles below Hog River. Earlier, I had seen where Weaselheart had searched out and cut open all the hideout houses and allowed them to freeze. On the day I figured they might be taking the house, I went to the lake. Sure enough, Weaselheart was near the beaver lodge, and Josie was inside it. She had already taken out one big beaver, almost as big as herself. It was an honest super blanket size. Beaver skins are stretched round and graded into sizes: small, 40 to 44-inch diameter; medium, 45 to 49 inches; large medium, 50 to 60 inches; 54 inches; large, 55 to 59 inches; extra large, 60 to 64 inches; blanket, 65 to 67 inches, and super blanket, 68 inches and up. After they had chopped into the top of the lodge, Josie had climbed in. The beaver on the resting platform dived into the water of one of their exit tunnels. Then they lay there, facing Josie, their chins on the edge of their resting platform. Josie kneeled, and with bare hands she seized the largest beaver by both front legs. Once she had her hands on the beaver's legs, she never let go. She lifted the heavy animal past her chest and face, over the edge of the hole, and passed it to Weaselheart, who killed it with a club. The old Koyukon stories say that beaver lifted in this manner will not bite or struggle, provided the person doing the lifting has no fear. All beaver living in a lodge are taken in such an operation. Tradition says that if the young ones are lifted out first, the other, larger beaver may fight and bite. "You want to try?" Weaselheart asked me. Reluctantly, I said, "Yes." Josie in the beaver lodge exploded in the Koyukon tongue. I could not understand her long harangue. "Are you sure?" Josie then asked me. "If you are even a little bit scared, you may get bitten. I wouldn't try it if I were you. If animals smell fear, they bite." I decided she was doing all right, and maybe I had better just watch. Beavers have powerful jaws, and their teeth are big and sharp. As I watched, Aunt Josie went back to work. She lifted the next largest beaver out of the water, eased it past her chest and face, clearly within biting distance, and put it where Weaselheart could club it. I watched her boldly catch and lift out 5 beaver, making a total of 6 that came from that house: parents, yearlings, and young of the year. "Uncle Peter, why did Josie give you hell when you invited me to go into the beaver house?" I later asked Weaselheart. She say, "Don't you know our old stories? They say you don't change places in the house after you take some beaver out. The beaver will get scared of the new person trying to catch them, and the new person usually gets hurt. The beaver don't trust anyone anymore. They are then lost, for they swim off and die," he explained. How many hundreds, perhaps thousands of years were needed for Koyukon people to learn this technique? And only with instructions passed from generation to generation did anyone of my mother's generation know how to take beaver in this manner. Spring beaver hunting with rifles, an annual activity for half a century, nearly wiped out Alaska's beaver. Half the shot beaver sink and are lost. I remember shooting 10 or 15 beaver and returning home with 7 or 8. One night I returned with 22. I don't know how many sank. A careful and experienced hunter went prepared with a spear and a throwing weight with hooks attached to a light rope for retrieving the animals. This saved many beaver that would otherwise have been lost. Beaver and sea otter were among the most important animals in the early Russian fur trade when Russia claimed Alaska. By 1910, Alaska's beaver seemed bound for extinction, and between 1910 and 1923, killing of beaver was prohibited. The season reopened in 1923, and in 1926, a season limit of 20 per hunter was set, but beaver again became so scarce that in the late 1930s and 40s, the federal government closed the season. Beaver are prolific, and within a few short years, they returned in good numbers. After that, shooting was prohibited, and each trapper was limited to a specific number each season. Today, in the Koyukuk, the animals can legally be taken only with traps and snares. At first, the limit was 5, then it went to 10 and 20. Now, in many areas of Alaska, there is no limit. Warden Sam White taught us how to trap beaver under the ice using a simple pole set. This required cutting a hole in the ice of a beaver pond and thrusting a pole through it with bait sticks of poplar nailed to it. A trap was fastened to the pole near the bait sticks. Once we learned this system, we improved on it. George Atla, Sr., became an expert at trapping beaver under the ice. He perfected a system that we call the crooked stick set. One spring, Jimmy happened to hit George's trail during beaver trapping season. Jimmy wasn't catching many beaver, so he followed Atla's trail and studied his sets. The following winter, he tried Atla's method. Like Atla, he used an L-shaped pole or heavy stick. The bottom half of the L lies beneath the ice and parallel to it. The top half of the L projects almost a foot out of the ice. A number 21 jump trap or a number 4 jump trap with teeth with the leaf spring nearest the pole is tied to the horizontal arm of the L, exactly 1 shovel's depth, metal part only, beneath the ice. Bait sticks, usually poplar twigs, are shoved straight down the hole in the ice so they are just above the trap. This set catches mostly big beaver. A good beaver trap costs $25 to $30 nowadays instead of the $5 or $6 I used to pay. Because of the high cost of traps, most who seek beaver now use snares, which are much cheaper. There are many variations in snare sets for catching beaver under the ice. One year I caught 178 beaver with help from my family. One night I brought home 20, including 14 super blanket size and half a dozen smaller ones. I skinned them in the tent where we lived during beaver season. I used to skin a super blanket beaver clean in 20 minutes or less, and I finished skinning all 20 of those beaver before I went to bed that night. I've always followed the traditional Koyukon custom of removing the innards of beaver in a special way. The procedure is to skin the beaver, leaving the feet and tail on the carcass. I remove the castorum, 2 large glands under the base of the tail, carefully, without cutting any tubes. Then, I cut off the head low on the neck and carefully remove all of the viscera by cutting loose the kidneys, liver, stomach, intestines, heart, lungs, leaving all attached to each other and the head. The important food part of the animal, a neatly cleaned carcass, remains. Then I throw the head and attached viscera back into the river or pond from which the animal was caught while chanting the old Koyukon words that mean, "Make lots more beaver." This is a way of showing respect for the beaver and appreciation for the privilege of trapping it. About this ceremony, an Indian friend once commented, "It doesn't bother a person who doesn't know about it, but I know the traditional beliefs, and it bothers me if I don't observe them." I'm in the same boat. Chapter 20. Spearing Grizzly Bears. When war came in December 1941 at the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, Jenny and I had 6 children: Franklin, Marie, Electa, Arnold, John, and Leonard. Nevertheless, I went to Anchorage to enlist in the Army. I had never seen such turmoil. People crowded the streets. Construction continued day and night, with trucks and tractors running continuously. At the Army recruiting office, I completed a questionnaire. The recruiter left and returned shortly with a civilian who said, "I understand you can work with metal." "Yes, I've done a little sheet metal work," I replied. Charlie Swanson had taught me some of the basics at Botsa River, and I had once worked for a short time helping on a sheet metal job at Galena. "We need sheet metal workers at Fort Richardson," he said. "You don't have to go into the Army. We'll give you a draft classification that will keep you out of the service." "But I want to do my share," I said. During World War II, every able-bodied Alaskan wanted to help his country. "You can help best by working for us as a sheet metal worker," he answered. I went to work at Fort Richardson near Anchorage as a sheet metal roofer on January 1st, 1942. 1 week later, I was promoted to sheet metal roofing foreman. I worked all spring and all summer, night and day, for as many hours as I could stand. I bought a house in Anchorage, and Jenny and the kids joined me. I had never lived under such stress. People were everywhere, crowding and pushing. We stood in lines to buy clothing, food, and cigarettes. Everyone was in a hurry. Living was expensive, although I was making more money than I had ever dreamed of making. That fall, as I put roofs on military buildings, hundreds of flocks of geese flew over. With every flock heading south, I'd raise my eyes and remember the sweet silence of the Koyukuk, the smell of spruce forests, the yelp of sled dogs, and thousands of square miles of beautiful, unpeopled land. Those great V's of birds and their wild calls seemed to be telling me, "Sidney, you weren't bred to live like this. You don't belong in this crowded place." Finally, I went to the colonel in charge of the base. "I've got to leave, Colonel," I told him. "Why? You're doing a good job." "I've trained a man to do my job." I was unable to express my strong feeling of homesickness, but somehow he understood. He called Galena, where a new Air Force base was under construction, and found me a job as foreman of an oiling truck and a crew of 20 men. With relief and gratitude, I agreed to take the job. Jenny and I sold our Anchorage house and moved to Galena. At Galena, I was only a 10-minute walk from the Alaskan wilds where I had lived most of my life. I renewed my ties with the forests and streams by hunting, trapping, picking berries, and fishing in my off hours. The Galena Air Force Base was originally a Civil Aeronautics Authority, today the Federal Aviation Administration, airfield. During World War II, it was the first stop for Russian pilots flying American Lend-Lease warplanes from Fairbanks to Russia. During the war, I saw as many as 132 Bell Airacobra P-39 fighter planes parked there, awaiting improved weather so they could fly to Nome. Altogether, the Russians accepted 7,929 American warplanes at Fairbanks and flew them to Nome via Galena. From Nome, the planes flew across the Bering Straits to Siberia, then to the Eastern Front, where they flew in combat against the Germans. The Air Force decision to build at Galena created a boomtown on the north bank of the Yukon River, 575 river miles from the Bering Sea. About 35 people lived in Galena in 1941 at the start of construction. With the influx of people, the quiet village became a noisy tent city. During wartime, Galena's population ballooned to at least 3,000. The Air Force first arrived at Galena via the Yukon River with 6 barges full of tractors, trucks, and cranes. 20 soldiers were dumped on the beach with that heavy equipment. They had no blankets and no housing. The Koyukon people of Galena took those GIs into their homes as if they were their own kids, including the commanding officer, a Lieutenant O'Neill. The men slept and ate at the homes of native families, while they ran the tractors, cranes, and trucks to build the airfield. The Galena native homes were mostly small, simple log cabins, but they were warm and open to these hard-working young men. They became homes away from home for the soldiers, and many close relationships were forged. That winter, soldiers built a huge domed airplane hangar. To bolt the girders in place, they worked 150 feet in the air from buckets lifted by draglines, never losing a day of work, no matter how cold or how windy. I saw them working at minus 58 degrees. Those rugged men became highly respected for their accomplishments during the time they lived at Galena. Some of them fell in love with Alaska and our way of life. Upon discharge from the service, many settled in Alaska and married native girls. Life changed for many local residents who found permanent jobs at the Galena Air Force Base. From seasonal trapping and commercial fishing, with a consequent seasonal income, they converted to a partial cash economy with year-round income. Most continued to largely depend upon game and fish for food. In 1939, the last boat that Jimmy and I whipsawed lumber for and built at Hog River was the 32-foot Koyukuk. She was long and skinny, with a 5-foot beam and a reverse-curved bow. With the 20-horsepower Kermath marine engine we installed, the Koyukuk could make about 20 miles an hour, fast for the time. Jimmy's personal Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was the death of his wife Celia that day from tuberculosis. Jimmy and Celia had a daughter, Christine. 3 years later, Jimmy married Flora Charles. In time, they had 7 children, but Jimmy and Flora split up, and Jimmy kept all the kids and later married Marion, a girl from Koyukuk, who helped Jimmy raise all those kids, plus an adopted daughter. When Jimmy and Marion split up, he never remarried. In 1943, with the Koyukuk, Jimmy started towing rafts of floating gasoline barrels from Nenana to the Air Force Base at Galena, where the fuel was needed for Russia-bound warplanes. The barrels were held together with 2x4 frames, and some of the rafts held as many as 2,055-gallon drums. Jimmy towed these rafts down the Tanana River to the Yukon River, then down the Yukon to Galena. At Galena, the Army picked 4 drums at a time out of the water with a drag line. Thousands of those barrels, empty and full, were eventually scattered around Galena, along back trails and in the woods. Alaskans nicknamed gasoline drums Tundra Daisies, for they seemed to sprout everywhere in the territory. In the spring of 1943, after sticking to my wartime jobs at Anchorage and Galena for 17 months, almost without a break, I applied for a month of leave and mushed a dog team from Galena to the headwaters of the Huslia River, a tributary to the Koyukuk. I wanted to make a lone hunt for beaver. After the stress of wartime work, the hunt and the solitude were more important to me than any money I would make. But on the way, at cutoff, I encountered Louis Golchik, a Koyukon elder, who was dying of tuberculosis, and he asked me to take him with me. "Sidney, it will be my last hunt, for I don't have long to live," he said. "I promise I won't be in your way." "Sure, Louis," I agreed, for he was a wonderful old man. "If you'll take care of camp, I'll do the rest." We traveled by dog sled, pulled by 2 of my poorest dogs, and 3 dogs given to me by Stephen Atla. Atla was leaving for military service, and he had to get rid of his dogs before he left. Upon reaching our destination, we killed the dogs, and after breakup, drifted back downriver in canoes we made, with spruce frames carved with axe and knife and covered with canvas I had hauled in the sled. During our hunt, we lingered over many evening campfires when I should have been hunting, because the failing Louis wanted to share his memories. During that time, he told me of the last Koyukon winter spear hunt for grizzly bear. He had been one of the hunters. I have hunted with several older Koyukon men who sometimes talked about the old ways and the old days, including Johnny Oldman, Little Sammy, Edwin Simon, and Louis Golchik. Many aspects of old Athapascan culture are almost unknown because of a taboo against talking about them. In modern times, many elders have been reluctant to talk because they don't want to be considered superstitious, for some of their beliefs would be so labeled today. Another compelling reason for silence was humility. Because he was dying, Louis Golchik was willing to talk about forbidden subjects. For many years, out of respect for the elders, I have not discussed many of the old beliefs or repeated stories I heard. But most of the elders I once knew are gone, and many young Koyukon people are unaware of the old beliefs. I am in my last years, and I would like to see preserved a few of the old beliefs and stories. Early Koyukon hunters never talked about big game animals in the presence of a woman. This was a cultural taboo, and was particularly true for the brown or grizzly bear. Their respect for the big animal, as the grizzly was always obliquely referred to, was close to fear. This is not surprising, considering that the early hunters had to face this, the largest and fiercest North American land carnivore, with nothing more than a spear or bow. and arrow. That some Koyukon people deliberately sought the grizzly bear with a spear has always amazed me. Hunting a grizzly with a spear required detailed planning and preparation. The spear handle, upon which the hunter's life depended, was the most critical part of the preparation. Before venturing after a bear, spear in hand, the hunter had to know if the spear could withstand the powerful blows of a grizzly bear's paws. The handle, helve, or length of the spear, always cut in July, was made from a birch tree growing on level ground. The best birch for a handle grows near a river where large spruce trees provide shade from the hot summer sun. Slow-growing trees, not more than 2.5 inches in diameter, were sought. The bark had to be pinkish-brown, with no loose bark. Very small, clean, horizontal lines on the growing birch were a sign of its strength. A suitable birch tree was cut, leaving about a foot-long stump. To test the grain and the quality of the wood, a piece was cut from above the section to be used as a handle. An axe was placed dead center across the end of the sample and hammered in a short way with a block of wood. If the birch didn't split, the axe was removed, and wedges of hard dry spruce were driven into the cut. If the birch still didn't split, it was considered suitable. The birch handle was then burned with the bark on. Heat was driven from the outside into the center of the wood, tempering it. After the bark was burned off, the pole was hung from the butt end to dry in the shade in an out-of-the-way spot where no woman could see it. After many weeks of drying, it was again tempered by fire, with the shine being slowly burned off. The end on which the point was to be fastened was narrowed. The hand grip was left full size. The handle was then tested by beating it on a large tree that had the bark peeled from it. After beating it in every way possible that might break it, the pole was placed over a fire to see if expansion of the wood revealed any cracks. Even a hairline crack was sufficient evidence of weakness to discard a handle. Only a handle that passed all of these tests was considered suitable for a spear. Both the point, often made from a sharpened bone from a grizzly, and a crossbar were attached with wet rawhide. As rawhide dries, it shrinks. This tightened both the crosspiece and the point so that both were rigidly attached. The crosspiece, fastened about 9 inches from the tip, acted as a stop, preventing the spear from entering the bear too far. When the grizzly was hunted during summer or fall, the hunter most often went alone, for more than one hunter could distract a bear, making him more unpredictable. The hunt was ruined if a woman learned about it, for that put a curse on the hunt that could cost the hunter his life. Sometimes a woman, learning of a hunt, warned the man, "Don't go, we've heard of your plans." When that happened, the hunter canceled the hunt. If, after many days of a summer hunt, a hunter failed to locate a bear, the bear was telling him that he, the bear, had the advantage. Perhaps the hunter would believe someone had talked or bragged about the hunt. If all went well and a lone hunter sought the big animal in summer or fall, he tried to find it on hard ground atop an open ridge. In spring or fall, frozen ground was acceptable, although it is sometimes slippery. The hunter had to select a place with ground on which the end of the pole would not slip after the spear had entered the bear's chest. The grizzly bear fears no other animal. In encounters with man, he normally goes on his way in peace. But when challenged, surprised, or angered, he may attack. His great strength and size, his huge teeth, and his 5 to 7 inch long claws make the grizzly a formidable killer. A grizzly can break the neck of a moose with one swat, and a big grizzly can carry a 1,000-pound moose in his jaws. In snow-free months, early Koyukon hunters seeking an encounter with a grizzly approached the bear and taunted it by shooting it with blunt arrows. This angered the animal, and usually it charged. The hunter held his ground. From a full charge, the bear habitually reared on hind legs within reach of the spear tip. The hunter quickly plunged the point into the animal's chest. Instantly, the hunter jammed the end of the spear handle against the ground and held it there, literally for dear life. The bear pushed forward. It never retreated. Both front paws beat upon the spear handle. The bear sometimes pivoted on the crossbar and circled as he tried to reach the hunter. The harder he tried, the more damage the spear point did to his lungs and or heart, and soon the grizzly toppled to the ground, dead or dying. Early in this century, a photographer arranged to take movies of a Koyukon hunter killing a grizzly in this manner. All went well until the bear charged. The photographer lost his nerve and fled while the Indian killed the bear, so he failed to get pictures of the actual killing. He did return shortly to take still photographs of the bear and the small Indian with a spear. The spear, tipped with sharpened bone made from the forearm of a bear, was only 5 to 5.5 feet long, shorter than the Koyukon hunter who used it. I once saw one of these pictures hanging on a wall in an old building at Tanana. Austin Joe and Chief Paul, two Koyukon hunters from Koyukuk Station, decided to make a winter hunt for grizzly with a spear. Both had helped take bears from a den about 10 years earlier. This was to be their last great test, the end of an era, for they realized that no Koyukuk Indian was likely to make such a hunt ever again. The knowledge of how to make such a hunt and the tradition of making them had nearly died out. To the old Koyukon people, killing a grizzly with a spear was the supreme test of a man as an individual and as a hunter. A winter hunt for a grizzly in its den was more complex than a summer hunt, for it required cooperation of at least 3 skilled, strong, and agile hunters. To kill one or more grizzlies at a den tested a hunter for speed, quickness, and character. His actions determined whether he could control fear, if he were a liar, whether he could keep his mouth shut, and whether he was a braggart. The hunt the failing Louis Gulchik described for me occurred about 1917, and I believe it was the last successful Koyukon winter spear hunt for grizzly. Here is his story. That fall, Chief Paul asked Tom Patsy and me to accompany him to 3,000-foot Heart Mountain. Its base is in the shape of a heart, about 40 miles up the Koyukuk River. His purpose was to hunt, with rifles, black bears for meat while they were feeding on blueberries, fattening themselves before winter. After we had killed a black bear, Chief Paul told us that we had been chosen to prepare for the supreme test of a Koyukon hunter, to take a big animal from its den with a spear. "You are the fastest and strongest young men on the Koyukuk and Lower Yukon," Chief Paul said. "You will be the fast men on this last great spear hunt for the big animal." Both of us were relatively small, 5 feet 7 inches tall, and weighing about 135 pounds, but strong. I had never been so honored, but I couldn't discuss the honor. That would have been bragging. I knew stories of famous hunters who had speared the big animal, both in the Koyukuk Valley and in the Nulato and Kaltag areas, but no Koyukon hunter ever admitted that he had taken or helped take a big animal with a spear. Chief Paul explained the rigid requirements. Not one word of the hunt could be mentioned. Idle talk could cost us our lives. We were not to ask how the old-timers hunted the big animal because no real hunter who had killed a bear would talk. A braggart wasn't worth listening to. "When the time comes, 2 of us will teach you," said Chief Paul. That surprised me. "Where is the other hunter?" I asked. "He is finishing some secret work. You know him. You will meet him this winter about 1 month before we try to take a big animal," Chief Paul answered. When the black bear hunt ended, Chief Paul told Tom and me to keep in shape by running to toughen our muscles. "I want you to secretly practice the pole vault too," Chief Paul said. We were to constantly think about what we had to do to beat the big animal in order to be real men and proud Indians, like our forefathers. Even when you defeat others in running or wrestling, never say you are faster, stronger, or better. That might hurt people's feelings. It might also give you problems during the hunt, Chief Paul warned. Chief Paul told me that a message would reach me in early December telling me where to go, and I was to travel by foot to a place somewhere on the Katil River to meet the other hunters. I left the Yukon River that fall and stayed with my sister, Martha Cleaver, and her husband on the Koyukuk River below the Dulby River. Tom Patsy spent the fall at Chips Island in the Koyukuk River below the Katil River. In December, word came that Chief Paul wanted me to travel to Chips Island, so I set out on snowshoes, camped one night, and arrived next day. I was in the best physical shape of my life. At Chips Island, I met 5 people: Tom Patsy, Austin Joe, Chief Paul, and Andrew Paul, Chief Paul's son. I will not mention the name of the other man, because it could embarrass relatives who are still living. He had bragged about taking a big animal single-handed with a spear. Chief Paul spoke to us. Austin Joe has found the den of a female big animal with 2 almost grown cubs. Tomorrow we'll cross over to the Katil, a river that flows into the Koyukuk from the west. There we'll practice at an old bear den, and you will learn what must be done. Austin Joe had also carefully prepared the spear for the hunt, following all the old traditions. After a walk of a day and a half to the old den, we rehearsed carefully. Each of us had a role, and each of our lives depended on the quickness, bravery, and ability of the others. To test Tom's and my pole vaulting ability, a big fire was built of spruce boughs. Each of us had to vault through the flames while wearing a fur parka. A scorched parka would have disqualified us for the spear hunt for the big animal. Both of us qualified. When we were ready for the hunt, the wind was wrong, blowing from the east. Because of the location of the den, we needed a north wind, and the stronger, the better. After waiting a day or two for the right wind, we camped within a mile of the den. The following day, we studied the den from a distance, becoming familiar with the approach and planning the route each of us had to follow to reach our positions at the den. The last evening before the hunt, we told traditional stories of long-ago hunts, tales handed down from generation to generation. Included were stories about hunters who had died when their spear hunt for the big animal went wrong. Conditions were perfect at daylight next morning. A light wind blew from the north, and the temperature was mild, about 0. We didn't eat breakfast because we feared conditions would change if we delayed. Chief Paul gave last-minute instructions, and the 5 of us swiftly moved to the occupied den. Tom Patsy, the fastest, carried an 8-foot vaulting pole of tough dried birch. He dashed to the den entrance, vaulted over it, and drove his vaulting pole across the den mouth. I followed and quickly drove my pole into place so that the 2 poles formed an X across the den opening. Big animal dens usually have dry, loose soil at the entrance, which permits poles to be driven into the ground so they won't slip easily. The 2 vaulting poles Tom and I held functioned as a gate, keeping the big animals in the den until the man with the killing spear was ready. The commotion we caused by vaulting into position and closing the den with our vaulting poles brought the old female to the mouth of the den almost as soon as the poles were in place. In front of the den, Austin Joe quickly cut a hole in the ground into which the handle end of the killing spear could be planted. Meanwhile, Chief Paul talked to the big animal in a language unknown to me. I was later told it was bear talk. Would the big animal accept the spear? Perhaps we would have to use one of the 2 .30-30 rifles we had brought. If the big animal didn't accept the spear, there could be many possible reasons. Did someone brag? Had word of our hunt somehow leaked? Had a woman seen the spear? Did any woman know about the hunt? While Austin Joe dug the hole, Andrew Paul and the other man joined Tom and me in holding the gate poles to prevent the big animals from pulling the poles in or pushing them out. Austin Joe finished the hole, and Chief Paul set the spear handle into it and braced himself. "Let the first one out," he called. We pulled our poles back, opening the den, and the big female rushed directly into the spear held by Chief Paul. The spear entered the big animal's chest. The crossbar held the animal off so that her powerful claws and teeth could not reach him. Chief Paul held the handle firmly in the hole in the ground, and with a mighty heave, using the momentum of the charging big animal, threw it right over himself. The big female flew about 25 feet downhill with its chest organs ripped to shreds and landed with a thud. It rolled a few feet and lay dying. The instant the big female left the den, Tom and I jammed our poles back into the ground to reform the gate. 2 nearly grown cubs remained in the den. Now the test. Chief Paul handed the spear to the man who had bragged about taking a bear single-handed with a spear. Chief Paul spoke. I helped take a big animal once with a spear. I never talked about it before. I know this is my last big animal, the one you see lying there, dead. This could be your last one, too. Now you try, because I don't believe you ever took a big animal with a spear. We never told you that we were going to try to take the big animals with a spear because we were afraid you would talk. Maybe you wouldn't go with us. I want to demonstrate to these men how not to brag and why no Koyukon should talk about taking big animals with a spear, trying to make a big man of himself. Obediently, the man accepted the spear. He tried to get the young, big animal at the mouth of the den to accept it. To test the big animal, he placed the point of the spear under its mouth, near the throat. The big animal slapped the spear aside. This meant he sensed fear in the man holding the spear. If the weapon had passed his face without the big animal slapping it aside, it would have meant that the man holding the spear was brave enough to handle that big animal. The big animal pushed the blade aside not once, but twice, indicating that the man was afraid. Then Austin Joe grabbed the spear, saying, "You lie. You never took a big animal by yourself with a spear. This one tell us. I never took one either, but I never lie. Now watch this." With that, Austin Joe called, "Open the den." Tom and I pulled our poles clear. One of the big animals charged. Austin Joe set the spear, and the charging big animal impaled himself upon it. Like the old female, the big cub was thrown through the air with lungs and heart shredded. The dying big animal landed far downhill near the adult. Austin Joe handed the bloody spear once more to the braggart, with the same results. The last big animal in the den pushed the blade aside. Then the spear was handed to one of the younger people. The third big animal charged and impaled himself, and the spearman tossed it down the hill to join the first two dead animals. One of the younger people was, of course, Louis. Old Louis Golchick refused to brag, even though he knew he was near death. For many years, the 18-inch-long metal blade from the spear used on that hunt was displayed in the home of trader Dominic Vernetti at Koyukuk Station. With lingering belief, Louis told me, "That spear point would not be good for another hunt. Too many women's hands have touched it. Too many people have seen it." Louis Golchick died a few weeks after we canoed down the Huslia River at the end of our beaver hunt. Jenny and I were divorced in 1944. We remained friends, and we both stayed close to our children. Later that year, I married Angela Pitka, a Koyukon girl of 18. Tall and strikingly beautiful, she was a woman of great determination and ability. She lost both of her parents early in life and was raised by an older sister and an aunt. In 1945, at war's end, Angela and I moved from Galena to Hog River, where I took up my old life on the trapline. I took enough fur so we had some cash. I killed enough game and caught enough fish to permit us to eat and live well. Ours was a simple wilderness life, much as I had lived for years before the war. In some ways, those years on the trapline with Angela were the best of my life. She helped me whipsaw lumber so I could build boats. She cut firewood, helped run the traplines, and caught, cut up, and dried fish. She often stayed alone while I was off running distant traplines or working at other jobs, which I was forced to do in order to make enough to take care of our growing family. Every year we had a new baby. First came Roger, then Elma, Carl, Annie, and Agnes. There were to be more. Chapter 21. Koyukuk Moose. September in the Koyukuk Valley has a special feel. Dark nights have returned, there is less heat to the sun, and at midday tree shadows have noticeably lengthened from those of summer. Nights, brilliant with northern lights, are crisp, and ice forms on the edges of ponds, a forecast of things to come. Yellow, gold, and red leaves splash the forest and hills. Great vyes of cranes and geese bound for a warmer land pass over, their musical cries drifting in their wake. It is the time to dig potatoes and use the last of the broccoli and cabbage that still hangs on in the garden. Blueberries, which ripen in the muskegs by the end of August, must be picked and sugared down before the frosts soften them. Crimson cranberries are firm and ripe shortly afterward, ready to put up in baskets or kegs. Firewood must be cut and split. Cabin chinking should be checked for tightness. Dried fish and meat must be stored. Early September is also time to hunt moose before the rut begins, and while the meat is still sweet and mild, yet when it is cold enough so that it won't spoil. One fine mid-September day in the late 1940s, I left our cabin in late afternoon, and alone, poled and paddled a small boat up Hog River. I had planned an evening hunt, hoping to find a bull moose near the river. Moose had moved into the Koyukuk and were becoming a more common part of our diet. Moose are best hunted at dawn and dusk when they are active. I eased my boat ashore, tied it, and with a .30-30 rifle in hand, followed a winding, well-used game trail through the spruce and birch forest beside the river. It was sprinkled with fresh moose tracks. I wore moccasins and soft fabric pants and jacket that made no noise as I eased past trees and through brushy thickets. I ghosted along for half a mile, then climbed to a favorite lookout where I could see a few acres of treeless tundra flats, the edge of a pond, and a few hundred yards along tree-lined Hog River. There I sat on a downed tree, watching, listening, absorbing the sounds, sights, and feelings of the land. I was content and fulfilled, one with the land. I didn't feel as if I owned it. I was simply a part of it, and it was beautiful and wonderful. I have always loved the evening hunt, especially when it is calm and clear. As the sun nears the horizon, a hush descends on the forest, and there is an expectancy in the air. Jays, thrushes, chickadees, and other small birds scurry about with occasional calls as they seek their night's shelter. The cool evening air is like wine, and a wool mackinaw and cottonwork gloves feel good. Moose may occasionally call. Cows sometimes make a peculiar high-pitched bird-like chirrup that carries for miles. Bulls may emit a deep, resonating grunt. Even the sound of water flowing down a steep creek may be heard for hundreds of yards in cool, still air. The shadows deepened. 2 ravens flew over, playing in flight. One folded his wings and rolled upside down, only to catch himself when he had dropped 20 or 30 feet. The other imitated his companion. Ravens are masters of flight and often play in updrafts. This big, intelligent blackbird eats anything: mice, carrion, birds' eggs, fish. They live in the Koyukuk country summer and winter. A great horned owl, an old acquaintance who lived somewhere in a nearby stand of spruces, called a deep, hollow hoo-hoo several times. It's a wonderful sound. In my mind's eye, I could see him sitting high among the branches, blinking his big yellow eyes, his round-eared head turning this way and that, as he contemplated the coming evening. I saw movement among the spruces by the riverbank. As I watched, a large bull moose quietly walked into full view, perhaps 100 yards away. Something about the forest that evening, the hush, the feel of the crisp air, the growing darkness, the occasional sounds of birds, the chirring of a red squirrel, gave the evening a magic feel that seemed more intense than any other time I could remember. The bull's yellow-gold antlers were clean, with no velvet hanging from them, and they projected a ghostly luminosity in the twilight. He stopped and stood quietly, listening and looking. He was what I had come for, and he was in easy rifle range. Yet I waited. Perhaps he would move closer. A careful hunter always likes his prey close. If the first shot doesn't down the animal, it is easier to get a second shot into it with the animal near. The moose walked toward me, following the trail. If he continued, he would walk so close I could not possibly miss him. Again he stopped. He wasn't alarmed. He had probably just left his daytime bed, and like a man awakening in the morning, he was stretching his muscles and his mind, readying himself for the evening feed. He was in no hurry. First, he wanted to know what was going on around him. He was watching, listening, and scenting the air to see who or what was near. I remained motionless on my downed log, eyes glued to the bull. He was a fine, big, fat, mature animal. His antlers spread more than 5 feet, and he stood a full 6 feet at the shoulders. In the fading light, he looked almost black. As he moved toward me, his body was occasionally silhouetted against the bright and calm water of Hog River. I prefer to take a small bull for winter meat, for they are easier to handle than a huge, old bull. Also, sometimes the meat of an old bull is tough. He continued his unhurried way toward me, and I mentally prepared myself for what was to come. A cartridge was in the chamber of the rifle, and it was loaded with 170 grains of lead. The tubular magazine was filled with 4 more cartridges, giving me 5 shots. To fire the first, likely the only one I would need, as I raised the rifle to my shoulder, I would draw the hammer back into the cocked position with my right thumb. To prevent a click that would alarm the moose, I would hold the trigger back. Once the hammer was back, I would release the trigger, then the hammer, and the rifle would remain cocked, ready to fire. I would aim at the bull's chest, the deepest part of his body. The bullet would go through his lungs, or, if I shot a little lower, I could hit his heart. A quick, merciful, and sure death for the hunted is the goal of every experienced hunter. If my bullet flew true, my big bull would stagger momentarily. Then he would stand, head down, provided I remained perfectly still and he didn't see or smell me. After another half a minute to a minute, he would collapse, dead, drowned in his own blood. This bull would drop within 100 feet of the river. It would be an easy job to carry the meat to my boat. In other years, when moose were scarcer, I had killed them so far from a river that I didn't even try to pack the meat. Instead, I had wrapped it in canvas to protect it from ravens and jays, and hung it high in a tree to retrieve it with a dog team after snow came. This moose would pose no such problem. The bull was within 25 feet. It was time for me to shoot. But the magic of the moment, the beauty of the surroundings, and the sheer magnificence of that great, alert, but relaxed bull compelled me to hold my fire. Also, I wondered, did I want this big, old animal? Would his meat be tender? As I sat, knowing he was mine, all I needed to do was to raise the rifle and pull the trigger. He stopped, swung his head about, and for long moments seemed to look straight at me. I remained frozen. Calmly, he swung his head back and silently and alertly moved on down the trail, into the trees, and out of sight. I didn't even lift my rifle. I'm not sure whether I chose not to shoot because he and the magical evening had given me so much pleasure, or because he was a bigger animal than I wanted. A few days later, I killed another, smaller bull, which provided us with our winter's meat. My vivid memory of that big bull still lingers, and in my mind at least, he still roams that wild trail on Hog River. The Alaska moose is the largest deer in the world. Bulls weigh from 1,000 to 1,600 pounds or more. Cows weigh 800 to 1,200 pounds. Colors range from pale yellow to pure black. They have a great drooping nose and huge ears, giving them a vaguely mule-like appearance. A moose may appear awkward and ugly, but like other deer, it is graceful in action, and it can stride across rough ground with a swift and smooth gait. A huge bull can disappear into a thicket or heavy timber with scarcely a sound. Bulls grow new antlers every year, shedding them usually in January or February and starting the new growth in the spring. The main foods of moose are willow, birch, aspen, and other twigs, although they may graze on sedges, grasses, pondweeds, and other shoots. Moose were virtually non-existent in the Koyukuk prior to the 1900s, according to the Koyukon elders I knew. William Dahl, the explorer, reported that in 1866 there were no deer, meaning caribou, or moose at Nulato, and that food, for the people, was often very scarce. At the time, he said, the Koyukon people in this Yukon River village depended mostly on fish and small game. None of the old Koyukon stories I have heard mention moose in the Koyukuk, although some stories of the upper Yukon mention the animal. There were no resident Koyukuk moose when I was a boy. The few that wandered into the valley from elsewhere were invariably tracked down and killed. Moose meat and the moose's valuable hide were highly prized by Koyukon and white residents, and when a moose track was found, every effort was made to follow and shoot the animal. After Charlie killed the moose I had located on Hog River in 1929, I didn't see another moose in the Koyukuk until 1935, when I killed one at Hog River. People who lived downriver from Hog River told me that fair numbers of moose had moved into the lower part of the Koyukuk Valley that year. I believe they came from the Melozitna and Tozitna river valleys to the east, where good numbers of moose had long lived. The deep snow year of 1937 was a turning point for moose numbers in the Koyukuk. That winter, I saw snow completely bury a cabin at Clear Creek, built by Charlie Swanson and George Lighton, and the ridgepole of that cabin was 14 feet above ground. After that incredible snowpack settled, moose could travel easily anywhere in the Koyukuk, for they sank in only about 18 inches, which their long legs handled easily. With the good traveling conditions, more of these big animals drifted into the Koyukuk from the Melozitna and the Tozitna river valleys, and perhaps from the Yukon River Valley, scattering up and down the entire Koyukuk. Since then, moose have been a dependable source of food for the residents. Koyukuk old-timers John Oldman and Edwin Simon often said that they didn't really know how to hunt moose because the animal was new to the Koyukuk. They told how, during their trapping years in the early 1900s, they sometimes ran into moose tracks in heavy winter snow and always followed the trail until they killed the moose, even if it took days. That, they said, was all they knew about moose. During that deep snow winter of 1937, I killed a moose for my uncle, Hog River Johnny, and his family. I drove my dog team to their cabin to tell them about it. "You want me to bring you the moose?" I offered. I could have hauled the meat in 2 loads. "Number." "We'll go to the moose," Johnny said. That was the old Koyukon way. When a hunter killed big game, his family moved to the animal. Using my dog team, I helped my uncle and his family travel to and set up camp where I had killed the moose. Uncle Johnny and his family butchered the horse-sized cow moose on the site, much as Chief John and Big Mary had done. They worked on that animal for days and used every bit. They even put out a few marten traps and made themselves at home in the traditional way. My uncle Weaselheart, trapping on the north side of Sun Mountain that winter, saw moose in numbers for the first time and learned that a moose has a temper. One day he passed a moose walking in the deep snow, and in a casual way he tossed a stick at it. Angered, the moose charged, but it broke through the snow crust with every lunge. Weaselheart, short-legged and heavy, wasn't very fast on snowshoes, but he quickly figured out how to escape the angry moose. Where tops of willows projected from the snow, drifts were 12 or 14 feet deep. Taking a chance, he ran across some of the willow tops where his snowshoes supported him nicely. The moose followed and floundered in the loose snow among the willows, so Weaselheart escaped. Mistreatment of an animal brings bad luck, according to old Koyukon tales, and Weaselheart wryly admitted he had momentarily forgotten those stories. "Never again," he vowed. "Don't play with animals," he warned me. "I have experienced many thrilling moose hunts with my family. I have instructed my sons and daughters on how to hunt, and I have allowed them to shoot the moose we find, for success brightens the lives of young people. They like to help to provide food for the entire family." The stories of our family moose hunts, which my kids told their friends, did them all good. I always enjoyed teaching them the old customs. We hunted mostly in and around lakes on brush-covered flats where I could teach them the art of hunting. They learned to watch the wind direction, for a moose has an acute sense of smell that can detect a man for hundreds of yards. When we spotted a moose we often removed our shoes to reduce walking noise. I warned the family not to wear jeans or other stiff fabric clothing that is noisy in the brush. They soon learned that a light rain makes hunting easier by reducing the noise they make. My son Arnold once used the skills I had taught him to kill a 3-year-old bull moose with a bow and arrow. After studying wind direction, he concealed himself behind a tree and shot that moose at a range of about 4.5 feet. While the kids were growing up, each fall my wife Angela and I took them on hunts for meat to carry us through the winter. We killed moose, black bears, ducks, and geese. We picked blueberries for syrup for hotcakes and cranberries for preserves. Most of my boys are men now, and each takes his family on hunts, like those Angela and I used to make. We included the girls in our family hunts too. Too many men want to hunt with just other men or sons. I've learned that women get more fun out of hunting than most men, and our girls probably worked harder at hunting than the boys. They were eager to learn how to cook over campfires and how to clean and dress meat. They liked knowing all the little tricks too, like cutting a brush pile to lay the meat on to keep it clean and to cool it quickly by allowing air to circulate around it. I've seen some tremendously big moose. One early afternoon, while on a family hunt on the Koyukuk River above the old town of Cutoff, my family was traveling in a riverboat. Angela and I had 5 children then, all under 10. We spotted a moose about a mile away as he bedded down not far from the riverbank. Angela took over the steering while I moved to the bow with my .30-30 Winchester lever action rifle. A 7-horsepower outboard motor pushed the long boat. Angela threw a piece of canvas over the motor to muffle the noise, and then she carefully eased the boat upstream toward the moose. We all crouched, listening to the sound of the boat pushing water aside and the low mutter of the muffled outboard. The wind was blowing from the moose toward us, so it couldn't catch our scent. Every Huntington there knew that the moose would be alerted if he noticed our slow-moving boat or saw one of us make a sudden move. Not one extra sound came from the boat. All eyes were fastened on the moose. Ahead of us was our winter's meat supply. We were all thinking of steaks, chops, roasts, and stews. From a mile away, the moose didn't look especially large. I'd have guessed that his antlers spread about 55 inches. He was about 50 feet back from the bank, lying in the goosegrass among 12 or 14-inch high young willows. As we neared the moose, the 5-foot-high cut bank hid us from him and helped to muffle the motor noise. When we got into the shallows, Angela cut the motor, and we slowly paddled and pulled the boat. As we came along under the bank, he raised his head, as most wild animals do from time to time, while chewing his cud. He was facing the woods. As he lifted his head to look around, I stood up in the bow, aimed, and nailed him right behind the ear. His head dropped, and that was all. He didn't move a muscle. The bullet hit his brain. He never knew what hit him. I stuck an oar into the soft mud bank, tied the boat to it, and we went to examine our prize. I couldn't believe the size of that moose. "Holy criminy, what am I going to do with this animal?" I asked Angela. I probably wouldn't have taken him if I had realized how big he was. In relation to his body size, his 62-inch spread antlers were small. One hindquarter later weighed 284 pounds. 2 hindquarters totaled 586 pounds. I estimated the front quarters at 300 pounds each. Front quarters weigh more than hind. That's 600 pounds for the front, 586 for the rear, for a total of 1,168 pounds of meat. The meat from a moose usually weighs about 50% of the animal's live weight. Alive, that moose probably weighed a ton. We let the carcass cool for a couple of hours while we set up camp and prepared to go to work. Angela wanted a good moose hide and decided this one would do. Unfortunately, the finest moose skin comes from pregnant cows killed in late March. Such skins, stretched from a cow carrying her calf, are more uniform in thickness than other moose hides. But such hides aren't available legally. We had to use ropes and spring lines to hold the legs up so I could cut up the animal. Although I was young and strong, I couldn't even lift one leg. We managed to roll him on his right side, which I've found is best for dressing a moose because the blood flows out more freely. Removal of the viscera is also easier when the moose is on his right side. We left the hind quarters intact, but cut the front quarters into smaller, easy-to-carry pieces. We hung all the meat in nearby trees to drip and dry. Angela carved the meat from the head. We left behind nothing edible. Edwin Simon and Bobby Vent, on a hunt, came along shortly after we had killed the big moose. They stared at the animal in disbelief. "That's as big as they come," Edwin remarked. "It'll probably be tougher than hell," I replied in disgust. "Don't be sure," he said. "If you caught him when he was asleep, that makes a difference." Bobby and Edwin camped with us and helped me load the hindquarters into our boat. We were in a good spot for moose and had hopes another would appear while we were butchering. Sure enough, about daylight, a fat young bull walked right into camp. Angela shot it. We stayed another day to clean and care for the meat of that animal. Edwin was right about the meat of that big moose. I hung it 20 feet or more above ground, where flies usually won't bother meat. At Christmas, when visitors came, we ran low on meat, so I knocked a hindquarter of the huge old moose down. 2 of us had all we could do to haul the aged meat into the house. After Angela thawed and cooked it, I rated that old bull as the best moose meat I ever ate. The greatest abundance of moose in the Koyukuk occurred between 1945 and 1955. By then, moose had become our livestock, as important to the Koyukon people as cattle, sheep, and hogs are to residents of agricultural states. Traditions become established quickly, and within a decade and a half, it became traditional for many Koyukon families to make an early September moose hunt in the Koyukuk Valley. It made a wonderful change in our lives to have fine moose meat to eat through the winter. In the middle and late 1950s, wolves, which like the moose had been absent from the Koyukuk Valley, followed the moose into the Koyukuk. Because moose was the wolves' main food, the wolves quickly increased, and as they did so, they killed more and more moose, and Koyukuk moose numbers began to dwindle. Chapter 22. Koyukuk Wolves. A few years ago, my son Gilbert, trapping on the Big Portage just below Coffee Can Lake along the lower Koyukuk River, caught a wolf in a trap. Gilbert had never seen a wolf in a trap. It looked like a beautiful gray dog, he told me. And because he didn't want to kill a fine sled dog, he approached the animal to release it. He planned to put a rope around its neck so he could handle it and examine the foot for injury. As Gilbert neared, the wolf lay down and made no attempt to bite, nor did it fight the trap. As Gilbert worked to open the trap, the wolf pulled as far from him as he could and turned his head away. "I could have petted him," Gilbert said. Once released, the wolf stood up, looked at Gilbert, probably in amazement, and swiftly ran off. Only then did Gilbert realize that the animal was a wolf. Gilbert's mistake is common. Wolves do look like and to a degree behave like dogs, and many people unfamiliar with wolves and their habits think of the wolf and man's best friend in the same terms. The wolf is Alaska's most efficient predator. He lives by killing other animals. His senses of smell, hearing, and sight are acute. He is intelligent and hunts cooperatively in small groups or occasionally in large packs. Koyukon hunters have great respect for the wolf and consider only the bear and perhaps the wolverine to have greater spiritual power. Mature wolves weigh from 75 to 150 pounds. Black wolves are common, and other colors include gray, white, and a brownish shade. Some wolves have a dark mask. Although wolves and dogs belong to the same family, wolves commonly kill and eat dogs that stray from camps or settlements. Occasionally, a dog chained near a cabin or at the edge of a village is killed by wolves. In the late 1970s, many Fairbanks residents became upset one winter when wolves killed many chained dogs at homes on the outskirts of that city. Once in a great while, a female dog in heat may breed with a wild wolf. One quiet evening in the fall of 1939, while hunting moose, I sat on a log at Hog River, looking over a little clearing. It was the time for moose to come out to feed. Then, for the first time in my life, I heard a wolf howl. I turned toward the sound, listening. Again came the long, low, quavering howl. It had a nice tone. To some people, the howl of a wolf is spine-tingling or chilling. But I enjoy hearing it, for it is a natural sound in the wildlands of Alaska. When I was a boy, no wolves lived in the Koyukuk Valley, or they were so few that we were unaware of them. We never heard one, and we never saw a track. With none of their major prey, moose and caribou, living in the Koyukuk, they had no reason to be there. Throughout most of Alaska, besides moose and caribou, wolves also kill and eat Dall sheep and Sitka deer. Snowshoe hares are an important food in some years. In summer, moose and caribou calves are a common food. When moose became established in the Koyukuk in the late 1930s and then wolves arrived, as trappers we were pleased to be able to catch the animals for their valuable fur, although we quickly learned that wolves are smart and difficult to trap. At first, most of the furs were kept and used by Koyukon women in making winter clothing. Wolves continued to increase, for moose were abundant. An adult wolf eats 6 to 7 pounds of meat each day, and a pack of 10 wolves eats 60 to 70 pounds of meat daily. This is about 50 adult moose a year, or about 120 caribou. By the mid-1950s, wolves had increased enough to be a threat to the Koyukuk moose population. In 1972, Governor William A. Egan appointed me to the Alaska Board of Fish and Game. This board developed all hunting, fishing, and trapping regulations for the state and established policies for fish and game. At our long meetings, we studied reams of scientific information on various populations of fish and game, heard reports from fisheries and game biologists, and held public hearings. When the board was split in 1975, Governor J. Hammond appointed me to the Board of Game, where I served until early 1992. As a member of these boards, I learned much about wolves from scientists who provided us with basic biological information on Alaska's wildlife. Millions of dollars have been spent on studies of Alaska's wolves and their way of life. The availability of food, primarily moose, caribou, deer, sheep, is the primary determinant of wolf densities in Alaska. When these prey species are abundant and easily taken, wolves fare well and have larger litters, and more pups survive their first year. When food is scarce, smaller litters are produced, and mortality of pups increases because of starvation and cannibalism. Under these conditions, 50 to 60% of pups born each spring usually die within 8 months. A number of studies in Alaska have shown that when the ratios of wolves to moose drop below about 1 wolf per 20 moose, the moose population is unlikely to maintain itself, and it will probably decline. In some cases, moose have been entirely killed off from an area by wolves, at which time the wolves had nothing to eat, and they themselves either starved or left that area, leaving the land with no moose or wolves. Many people believe that wolves take only sick and misfit prey. Several Alaskan studies have shown that usually wolves take moose or caribou in almost exactly the same proportion as found in the prey population. A cow moose heavy with calf is the most valuable moose from the standpoint of the moose population, yet such a cow is most vulnerable to wolves. Moose and caribou calves are especially vulnerable, and they too are valuable from the standpoint of the moose population. The Koyukons respect the wolf as an intelligent animal and an efficient killer of big game. Elders say that early Koyukon people viewed the wolf as powerful and important, and in the days before rifles, they feared the animal. Until rifles, steel traps, and steel snares were available, it was not possible for the Koyukon people to take wolves in numbers. Rarely, wolves were killed with bow and arrow. Throughout Alaska, wolf skins are prized for making parkas, boots, and mittens. Among the Koyukon people, only men were supposed to wear wolfskin garments, but this tradition is not strictly observed today. The most important use of wolf fur is for a parka ruff. It is used in conjunction with wolverine fur. The wolverine fur lies immediately next to the face, where the bulk of frost forms from the breath on cold days. Long, stiff wolf fur protects the face from wind, and the coarse hairs shed frost easily. A good wolf parka ruff can extend a foot or more beyond the wearer's face. Wolves don't attack humans, although I am aware of one wolf attack on a child. Many years ago in the Bettles-Wiseman area of the Upper Koyukuk, toddler David Tobuk was playing on a beach along the river. Suddenly, a wolf ran out of the brush, grabbed him by the head with powerful jaws, and carried him off. A nearby Koyukon Indian named Napoleon, who saw the wolf steal the child, ran after the wolf with a rifle and shot it. I knew Napoleon, who told me the story. David Tobuk survived. He was captain of the Teddy H., Trader Sam Dubin's steamboat, which rescued us after our mother's death. David carried a large scar on his face from the wolf attack. Occasionally the scar became raw, and it bothered him all his life. Photos of David I've seen always show him with his head turned to conceal the scar. Eskimos tell interesting stories about the wolf. A few years ago, I hunted in the Kobuk Valley in Eskimo country and killed 4 caribou from a herd. While dressing them, I was careful to save the legs for the skin, which makes fine winter boots. 2 Eskimos, both about my age, arrived while I was working on the caribou. "Sidney, you're doing a good job, but you're doing one thing wrong," one said. I remained silent, knowing that these Eskimos were probably going to share a belief that they wanted me to observe. "You aren't taking the hooves off. You should do that," one suggested. "Okay, I'll do that," I agreed. They showed me how to cut all the hooves off, a simple job. Then they put all 16 hooves on a string. As I continued to work on the caribou, one of the Eskimos said, "This practice comes from an old story. We know the story is true, so we always cut the hooves off like that." Then the Eskimos told me their story. "A long time ago there were more caribou than now. Our people could kill caribou year-round. The animals never left. There were really too many caribou in the Kobuk Valley. Soon wolves became thick, and they, like the caribou, were all over the place. Our people had no way of killing them except with bow and arrow. They managed this difficult feat once in a while. So many wolves roamed the area that the Eskimos' lives were in danger, for the wolves were fearless. The wolves killed many caribou, and dead caribou lay everywhere. Day after day the wolves killed, and in about 2 years few caribou remained. Then the wolves started to kill and eat each other. Soon they were so hungry they started to attack the people. The Eskimos had no safe place to flee to, but old legends told them what to do. The legends told the Eskimos to go into their underground igloos, where they could keep fires going to keep warm. Since they couldn't leave their igloos because of danger from wolves, they began to run low on food. They knew that if they stayed inside their igloos long enough, the wolves would kill each other off. Then the people would be safe. Soon the Eskimos had nothing to eat, so they began boiling caribou hooves, which keep for a long time hanging in a cache. The hooves, of course, have some dried tendons and meat attached. They supply some nutritional needs. The hooves must be boiled and boiled before the broth is ready to drink. The Eskimos kept alive by boiling the caribou hooves and drinking the broth while they waited and watched. When the wolves no longer appeared, they ventured out of the igloos to resume life. They traveled to lakes and rivers to catch fish. By then, the caribou were all gone, having been killed by wolves. The wolves were also all gone, for they had eaten one another or starved to death. This story fascinates me for several reasons. It may be based on a time when wolves with rabies attacked Eskimos, or when healthy but very hungry wolves attacked these people. This traditional story also parallels the findings of Alaska's wildlife scientists that wolves in Alaska can and do sometimes wipe out their prey and then starve or depart the area. This may be why there were no wolves or moose in the Koyukuk in the late 1800s and the first 3 decades of the 1900s. And the Eskimos' story of wolves eating wolves is supported by findings of modern scientists. Wolf cannibalism is a trait well known to wildlife scientists as well as to the Koyukon people. In 1956, Donald Stickman, son of my Koyukon friend Joe Stickman of Koyukuk Station, operated a small air charter service on the lower Yukon. While flying above the Koyukuk River one day, Don saw 12 dead moose lying on a gravel bar and landed to investigate. Wolves had killed the moose, but they had eaten little meat. On some of the moose, only the tongues had been eaten. The wolves had ripped open the moose stomachs to eat the fat, kidneys, and livers. Most of the red meat of the moose was untouched, leaving it to go to waste. The moose had become the most important single source of meat for the Koyukon people. Don remembered the 1920s and early 1930s when moose were rare and people had to work hard for the fish and small game they needed for food. Moose in the Koyukuk made life easier. Don flew up and down the Koyukuk Valley searching for wolves, and he discovered more wolves lived there than anyone had imagined. He obtained a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and with my brother Jimmy as gunner, started hunting them from the air. That winter they killed 149 wolves. At the same time, trappers from Huslia, Hughes, Allakaket, and Alatna made a special effort to catch more of the big predators. In the winter of 1957 to 58, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agent reported finding more than 200 dead moose that he identified as wolf kills in the Koyukuk Valley. Again, Don Stickman and Jimmy hunted wolves from the air, and that season they killed another 150. That was enough to change the balance, and Don and Jimmy stopped hunting wolves. There were still wolves in the Koyukuk, and they are still present today. The wolves continue to kill moose, but wolf numbers had been reduced so that the moose herd was no longer threatened with decimation. During the 1950s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which managed Alaska's wildlife when Alaska was a territory, employed 6 or 7 full-time predator control agents who ranged over Alaska killing wolves. To the federal government, wolves were undesirable vermin that threatened valuable moose, caribou, and other animals. These agents used strychnine baits, often dropping them from airplanes. This use of poison was repugnant to most Alaskans. The poison killed not just wolves, but bears, birds, and other fur-bearers that ate it. The predator control agents also hunted wolves with airplanes as another way of attempting to reduce their numbers. When Alaska became a state in 1959 and management authority of fish and game was transferred from the federal government, Alaska halted statewide wolf control, banned the use of poison for any reason, dropped the bounty on wolves, and classified the wolf as both a fur-bearer and a big game animal. Aerial hunting for wolves as a sport was banned. Wolf management in Alaska is controversial. A very few Alaskans would like to see all wolves destroyed, while others strongly oppose killing wolves for any reason. Most Alaskans feel that management of wolves, as for Alaska's other wildlife, should be based on the sustained yield principle, allowing monitored harvest through trapping and hunting where wolf numbers justify it. I doubt the issue will ever be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. On a July day in the mid-1980s, Angela and I and several of our older kids were at our fish camp on the Yukon River. One morning, we saw some objects moving across the mile-wide river. At first, we thought they were ducks, but with binoculars, I made out 7 wolves. We jumped into a boat and sped to the animals, circling them at a respectful distance. It was a pair of adults with 5 pups. Why they chose to swim across that wide river, I'll never know. They had left hilly country, which is good wolf habitat, to swim to a brushy flatland area. Enjoying the sight, we followed them from a distance. When they reached shore, the pups were nearly exhausted. As they left the water, each animal shook itself, spraying water all directions. One had to lie down for a few moments to recover. All 7 stood looking at us for a few moments, and then they turned and disappeared into the brush. Chapter 23. Booze. I was splitting firewood. The temperature was minus 50 degrees. In deep cold, dry spruce is brittle, and when struck by a sharp axe, it usually splits easily. It is a satisfying chore, splitting firewood. I have always enjoyed seeing the chunks pile up, ready for the stove. It was January 1955, and I was at the Koyukuk River village of Huslia. On this day, the enjoyment ceased abruptly. The axe struck a knot on a chunk of frozen spruce, and a sliver of the knot flew up and embedded itself in my right eye. When I pulled at the sliver, some of my eye fluid flowed out. I ran to the schoolhouse where Eunice Berglund, the itinerant nurse, happened to be. All she could do was put Pontocaine, an anesthetic, into my eye. I suffered a lot of pain that night. The next day it was too cold for a plane to fly me to medical help, and I went through hell. On the following day, although it was still terribly cold, James Andy Anderson, the Wien airline bush pilot at Bettles, flew to Huslia and took me to the hospital at Tanana. A doctor took one look, gave me more Pontocaine, and Andy flew me to Fairbanks to eye specialist Dr. Hugh Fate. Dr. Fate worked on my eye all night, removing as much of the wood as possible. I had partial vision with the eye, but the damage caused a reaction to my other eye. By fall, I was using Pontocaine daily. Despite the medication, the injured eye throbbed painfully all the time, and I had to go back to Dr. Fate. "Sidney, your eye is deteriorating badly, and it's affecting your good eye. That right eye has to be removed. You'll never see well with it again anyway. Removing the one will help the other." The pain was so persistent and intense that I actually looked forward to having the eye removed. After half a year of steady pain, the relief was simply wonderful. In a short time, I was fitted with a glass eye, and strangers seldom spot it. With one eye, I could read, work, and manage daily life without difficulty. I lost depth perception, of course, and was unable to shoot flying geese for many years. But I learned the right formula, so now I do fairly well on wing shots. I've had no problems aiming with a rifle. Prohibition, in effect, from 1920 to 1933, didn't stop people in the Alaska bush from drinking. In fact, it fostered a pretty fair bootlegging industry in the Koyukuk and Lower Yukon country. Beer drinkers could legally make beer at home. A 3-pound can of malt syrup and about a pound of sugar could produce about 7 gallons of pretty good beer in 5 days. Charlie Swanson liked beer, and Dad drank it occasionally. When we all lived on the trapline together, the job of making beer often fell to Jimmy and me. Dad regarded beer as a food, a beverage to accompany meals. Beer was not a big deal to us kids. I got high on alcohol for the first time when I was 12 or 13 years old. Jimmy and I were bottling beer for Dad and Charlie, pouring it into bottles. We had a capper that fit all sizes of bottles, and we had just made a batch in a 25-gallon barrel. To get the beer out of the keg, we had to siphon it with a small rubber hose. Each time I started the siphon, I sucked a slug of beer into my mouth. Naturally, I swallowed it. By the time we had bottled 25 gallons of beer, I felt pretty high and had to go to sleep. When I awoke, I was violently ill from all that raw beer. Before I married at the age of 18, I drank some. Jimmy and I used to make our own whiskey, competing with some of the villagers to see who could make the best booze. At times, it seemed as if almost everyone in the Koyukuk and Lower Yukon country owned a still. We bought a 20-gallon copper close boiler with a lid that could be tightly sealed. The boiler held about 10 gallons of brew. We made a neat coil from 3/8-inch copper tubing, and we soldered all our connections. Bootleggers I knew believed that the tubing had to be at least 14 feet long to make good booze. Some Indians dismantled shotguns and rifles, such as a .3030 Winchester, to use the gun barrel for the condenser to make booze. For some, booze was more important than guns. In the early 1930s, a Model 94 lever-action Winchester cost $23. I knew individuals who would lie down at the end of a gun barrel, waiting for the condensed booze to drip into their mouths. These were the drinkers who suffered. Blindness and even death sometimes resulted from the strong stuff. My Uncle Hog River Johnny went blind from drinking bad booze, as did many others in the Koyukuk. Some of the bad booze contained fusel oil, an acrid poison that accumulates in insufficiently distilled liquors. Home-distilled whiskey was especially bad if it weren't run through charcoal or distilled sufficiently. In our bootleg business, Jimmy and I sold a ketchup bottle full, slightly more than a pint, of whiskey for $5. We each had our own barrel, and we tried to outdo each other in quality. At the time, neither of us drank much. In the 1930s, many Koyukon Indians commonly traveled to Cutoff for holidays or after trapping season ended. Everyone wanted to try the other fellow's booze. We all feared the government revenuer, a fellow named Sidney. He never did come to Cutoff despite our fears. Nevertheless, we always cached our gallons of booze in snowdrifts and among the trees out of sight before entering the village. After everyone except the revenuer was in the village, we would retrieve the hidden booze and have a big party. Some of that stuff was absolutely terrible. I often recall how my friend Little Sammy once reacted to another fellow's booze. When offered a bottle, Little Sammy gulped a big swallow. He made an awful face, and he choked so he could hardly talk. Nevertheless, he croaked, "Boy, that's good stuff." Drinking was a phase I guess I had to go through. I used to have a good time drinking, or at least I thought I was having a good time. As the years passed, I drank more and more. After Prohibition ended in 1933, I would leave my trapline at the end of the season, go to Cutoff or Koyukuk to pay my bills, charter an airplane to fly to Ruby, and return with a plane load of booze. Everyone who wanted to drink with me would show up, and I'd hand each a full bottle. I loved the taste of Scotch whiskey, and over the years, I probably drank enough of it to float my house. Once at Koyukuk in the late 1940s, I started drinking with my buddy Heyman Henry, a fine old Koyukon. I don't know how many days our party lasted, but I forgot to eat. We danced and drank. I don't remember everything, but I thought we were having a great time. I finally realized it was time to return to my trapline. Heyman had a camp and trapline near mine, up the Yuki River on the south side of the Yukon, near Galena. When we left Koyukuk, I didn't have any whiskey because Dominic Vernetti wouldn't sell me any, cash or otherwise. "You've been drinking long enough, Sidney," he told me. Heyman and I chartered the plane of Hans Rutzebeck, who flew us to Heyman's camp. Heyman gave me one last drink of whiskey from his bottle, and then Hans flew me to a lake a few hundred yards from my tent camp, where he landed his ski plane in deep snow. Hans unloaded me and my gear and took off. Snow blasted high as the little call airplane lifted into the air. I staggered around for a while, fell, and had difficulty getting up. That last slug of booze from Heyman's bottle hadn't helped my condition. Although the temperature was about minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I threw a caribou hide on top of the snow beside the trail, unrolled my sleeping bag on it, and crawled in. I had a new Woods eiderdown sleeping bag for which I had paid $250. A lot of money then. Sometime during the night I awoke, feeling as if something were sitting on my legs. I couldn't move either leg, but I could move my hands. The Colt Woodsman .22 pistol I always carried was inside my sleeping bag. I found the gun and fired a couple of shots toward the end of my sleeping bag at whatever was sitting on my legs. If anything was there, it got off. It might have been my imagination or a nightmare. I don't know. I was in bad shape. I got up at daylight. The weather seemed warmer, and I felt a little better. I put on snowshoes and walked the several hundred yards to my camp. Snow had collapsed my tent over the wood stove. I straightened up the mess. As I worked, I began to go through withdrawal. I couldn't eat, and I had the shakes. Nonetheless, I thought I was in good enough shape to cover my 10-mile-long trapline, so I set out. On snowshoes, I crossed the lake and started up the hill. Looking ahead, toward the mountain, I saw a huge pink elephant coming over the top of the ridge. I stared at this incredible sight, then closed my eyes. I looked again. The pink elephant was still there, walking toward me. I couldn't handle that. I turned in my tracks and went back to my tent as fast as I could go. After building a fire, I warmed some water and took a sponge bath. Then I drank a little coffee and crawled into my sleeping bag. When I fell asleep, whatever it was again settled on my legs. I awoke, feeling my legs being pushed down. Again, I fired my pistol at the unseen something, and the weight seemed to leave my legs. The next time I awoke, I was in good enough shape to run my trapline. In a few days, I was all right and eating ravenously. Hans Rutzebeck returned and landed his ski-equipped Call Air on the nearby frozen lake. "How you doing, Sidney?" he asked. "Okay now. I had to chase an elephant off the hill up there the other day, though," I told him sheepishly. "That bad, were you?" he commented. "I guess I was," I admitted. "I wasn't going to pick you up, but I landed at Heyman's camp and he was worried about you, so I thought I'd check." I told him I'd run my trapline, had caught quite a bit of fur, and I was ready to fly back to Hog River to take care of my trapline there. That winter, I ran 3 traplines. Angela and the kids, with a dog team, lived at Hog River near one line. I had another trapline on the Huslia River not far from there. My third line was the one at Yuki River, where I had seen the pink elephant. Hans flew me between the 3 trap lines all winter. My flying bill came to about $2,800 for the season, and I trapped about $11,000 worth of fur, one of my really big years. We loaded my furs, sleeping bag, and other gear into Hans's plane. The lake, only 650 or 700 feet across, offered a short run for takeoff. The air was still. I had cut down tall trees at the edge of the lake, leaving an opening for a plane to fly through. Hans headed for that opening with the engine wide open, but he couldn't get airborne. He stopped, turned the plane, and tried to take off in the other direction, taking advantage of the ski tracks he had just made. The dense -50-degree air gave the wings good lift, but the engine didn't run smoothly because of the extreme cold. Finally, Hans lifted the plane off the lake. We were at low altitude, still climbing, when the carburetor iced up. The engine coughed a few times and died. The airplane staggered on the edge of a stall, one wing dropped, and down we went, nose first into the ground. We hit a stand of small spruce trees and skidded for a ways, splintering trees and ripping fabric from the plane. Then we slid between 2 large trees and stopped. The wings were half ripped away, and gas poured from the 2 wing tanks. "Get out before it blows!" Hans yelled. Neither of us was injured, and we got out quick. No explosion occurred, and we hiked back to my camp. Hans was terribly upset about the loss of his $5,000 airplane, and he wanted to walk to Galena immediately. In a straight line, the distance was about 50 miles, but afoot he would have had to travel closer to 100 miles. "Take it easy, Hans. Someone will pick us up after a while," I consoled. We waited 8 days until a Pan American Airways plane, Pan Am was one of Alaska's early airlines, circled after the pilot spotted the wreck. He notified another pilot with a small plane who flew in to pick us up. Through the 30s and 40s, I continued to drink. I sold the stuff, but often I was my own best customer. Eventually, in the 1950s, I felt I needed booze all the time. I tried tapering off, but it didn't work. I suppose I would have been classified as an alcoholic. I've heard people talk about how sick they have been from heavy drinking. Believe me, I've been there. One of my worst drunks lasted more than 40 days. That binge was a byproduct of the 1945 flood of the Yukon River. I was at Galena when the flood came. Everything floated off, including 55 gallons of medical alcohol from a warehouse at the Galena Air Force Base. I salvaged the full porcelain-lined barrel and, with friends, mixed the stuff with fruit juice or whatever else was available. It took a couple of us 6 weeks to drink it up. After being on that stuff, I woke up one morning and looked across the Yukon River. Everything appeared orange. My eyes were bloodshot, I guess. I was scared enough to quit drinking, for a time. I didn't stay dry long. When the village of Koyukuk seemed absolutely dead, I'd go to Dominic Vernetti's store and buy a few cases of booze and beer. "Come on, boys, let's have a dance," I'd invite, and we'd have a heck of a party. I really enjoyed partying. I met friends that way. Some of my best friends were my drinking buddies. The Indians in the Koyukuk and along the Yukon have used booze since white men arrived. Many of the villages have liquor stores, although a few have voted themselves dry. I've noticed that people who come to Galena from villages where alcohol is not available drink heavily. Some drinkers sell their guns, their traps, their snow machines, any possession worth money, to buy booze. Today, drugs are available in Alaska's native villages, and the combination of drugs and booze is frequently lethal. Oceans of booze have been sold to Indians, Eskimos, and Aleuts in Alaska's villages. Money spent on drinking could have paved many village sidewalks with gold. Alcoholism is a tragedy for which the people themselves must develop a solution. Throughout my drinking days, I always paid my bills and managed to support my family. But the day arrived when I realized that I had to lay off the booze. Angela contracted tuberculosis and had to go to a hospital for 6 months, leaving me to care for our 14 children. Tuberculosis, known as the scourge of Alaska in the 30s and 40s, is a terrible disease that was probably brought to Alaska by the early Russians. It was the most deadly of all the infectious diseases to which Alaska natives had had no prior exposure and hence no immunity. Wherever explorers, traders, miners, settlers, and missionaries went, the incidence of tuberculosis increased among the natives. Tuberculosis is a bacterial disease that develops slowly compared to diseases like whooping cough, measles, smallpox, and typhoid. It is usually transmitted from one person to another through the air, spray droplets from a sneeze or a cough. Most often attacking the lungs, it leads to difficult breathing and eventually to death. Tuberculosis of the lungs was also known as consumption. Crowded living conditions, poor ventilation, and undernourishment assisted in the spread of tuberculosis among Athapaskans of Alaska's interior. From the 1920s through the 1940s, it affected in one way or another virtually every Indian in the Yukon and Koyukuk valleys. It came close to home for me. About 1924, while she was at Anvik Mission, my sister Ada went for a long winter walk with a group of girls. One of the weaker girls was poorly dressed and became cold, and Ada removed her own coat and put it on the girl. By the time they returned to the mission, Ada was thoroughly chilled and she contracted pneumonia, which broke her health. Her resistance low from pneumonia, she soon was infected with tuberculosis, which killed her several years later. When I first started living at Hog River, I remember returning to the Yukon River in spring to discover that many of the pretty young girls I had known and danced with the previous fall were dead from tuberculosis. My uncle Hog River Johnny and his wife Molly, living at Cutoff, had 6 healthy children when the disease struck their family. Within 2 years, all 6 children, plus a newborn baby, had died. They built a new home and moved into it, also at Cutoff, and started another family. They had 7 more children that ranged from 3 to 18. The oldest was married. Then all 7 died of tuberculosis. Some of those kids were older than I was, some were about my age. I frequently stayed with the family when I was in Cutoff. In the winter of 1933, I offered to take Walter, who was 18, and his 12-year-old sister Mildred to the Tanana Hospital with my dog team. But they were too weak with tuberculosis to make the trip. They would be taken by boat after breakup, it was decided. They didn't live to make it. I happened to be there when Walter and Mildred died within an hour of each other. The poor frightened girl watched Walter gasping for breath as he died, and an hour later she was dead herself. She held my hand right to the last. I tried to comfort and encourage her, but it was hopeless. Being the same age, Walter and I had been close. We had hunted together. It was a sad time. Molly contracted the disease and went to a sanitarium in Washington State for 3 years and returned, apparently cured. After her return, however, she recontracted the disease and died. My uncle Weaselheart lost 5 of his 6 children to the disease. Why his daughter Liza survived, I'll never know. She lived amidst all of those who died of that terrible disease. I saw strong young men contract the disease and die within 6 months. We called it galloping TB. Commonly 8 or 10 people from a village of 40 or 50 died during a year. In the 1930s and 40s, for every 6 babies born on the Koyukuk, only 1 survived. The other 5 died from tuberculosis. I saw it wipe out family after family. In Alaska in 1945, tuberculosis caused more than 70% of the deaths caused by communicable diseases, and the highest death rate was among the Indians, Eskimos, and Aleutians. The disease reached its peak of destructiveness in Alaska within a year or 2 of the end of World War II. Tuberculosis killed, maimed, or disabled thousands of Alaska natives, and not a few whites, until it was gradually brought under control in the 1960s by a combination of intensive case finding and the development of new anti-tuberculosis drugs, notably isoniazid, which could be used not only as treatment but also as a preventative. Today, several antibiotics are used together, taken continuously for several months to cure the disease. When my wife, Angela, contracted the disease, it had a sobering effect on me, literally. I went into the Galena bar, where about 20 people were sitting around drinking and talking. At the time, Drinks cost $1 each. Set 'em up for everybody, I told the bartender. Then, for myself, I bought a bottle of beer, something I rarely drank. It'll be a long time before I have another drink, I told the crowd as I set down the empty bottle. That was in April 1963. Angela recovered, and I haven't had a drink since. Chapter 24. Galena. I loved the life of a trapper, but as the family grew, the dollars I made on the trap line didn't stretch far enough. We had lived in Huslia for about 10 years, and I had been trapping winters. Now, in the early 1960s, some of the kids were thinking about going to college, which called for a lot more money. I had friends who worked for the Air Force at Galena, making good money year-round, and I decided to try to get a job there as a carpenter. During 2 winters on the trap line, I spent every night studying books on carpentering. I memorized the mathematics of the framing square. I learned how to frame a building, how to cut rafters, and how to build cement forms, all from those books. Then we moved to Galena in 1963. I passed the union's written carpenter test and worked 6 weeks as a union carpenter. I went on to other carpentering jobs at Galena, working for $6 an hour. Next, I took the carpenter's test for the Air Force and got a high score, which landed me a job as a foreman, a job that lasted for 12 years. In my spare time, I built and sold boats. In my life, I've built 112 boats of various sizes, either for sale or for my own use. I once designed and built a 60-foot-long scow for Dominic Vernetti to use on the Yukon River for hauling up to 20 tons of salmon. Building it upside down, I turned it over with human power, using double and triple blocks. Dominic also used that scow to haul freight for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. At Galena, in addition to taking care of all the kids and running the house, Angela made fur slippers, parkas, mittens, and marten fur caps to order. After we were settled in, during the summers, Angela and I put a gill net in the Yukon to catch salmon for our own use. Runs of both chum and king salmon had greatly increased under state management. In fact, starting in the 60s, salmon, moose, caribou, black bear, and beaver were abundant. No one could remember when there had been such natural wealth in and around the Koyukuk. After we had been fishing for several seasons, one day we caught far more fish than we could easily use. I called Frank Donaldson in Anchorage, who owned a market and sold fish. "Send me 20 or 30 and let me see what they're like," he said. After cleaning those fish until they were as shiny as a new dime, I made boxes for them, and we shipped 30 king salmon that averaged 25 pounds. Donaldson paid us 30 cents a pound for whole, uncleaned fish. Freight cost a dime a pound, leaving a profit, less labor, boxes and shipping of about 20 cents a pound. Not bad. At the time, Alaska had a Youth Corps program in which kids could earn a few dollars an hour and gain experience by working. My kids could not qualify for the program because I was employed, and so they had to try to find other jobs. Charlie and Henry, 2 of my boys, fruitlessly scoured Galena for jobs. I remembered my own youth when Dad, Jimmy, and I needed to make a stake to get back into the trapping business after the flood at Batsa River. "We'll build a fish wheel," I told the boys. "That'll give you a way to earn a few dollars." I wrote Whitney Fidalgo Packing Company in Anchorage and asked if they could use some Yukon River chum salmon. It was fall, near the end of the annual salmon runs, so we had to hurry. The Whitney Fidalgo buyer wasn't sure he could use watermarked salmon that have lost their bright silvery seagoing appearance and are changing color as they approach spawning. Hesitantly, he said he'd take a few. I helped Charlie, Henry, and Terry Pitka, one of their friends, build the fish wheel and place it at our fishing site. They caught many chums and cleaned them carefully, and we built boxes and shipped them to Anchorage. "Send more," was the response. With this good news, the company sent a supply of wet-lock boxes designed for shipping salmon. By the time school opened, each of the 3 boys had earned about $1,000. The following 2 or 3 seasons, we continued to ship salmon to Whitney Fidalgo, and each year our catch increased. Then a company executive came to Galena to talk with me about getting more salmon. To handle them, a holding facility, complete with a $50,000 ice machine, was necessary. "Fine," I said. "If you want to install a plant, we'll do the work, but you'll have to finance it without interest." The company agreed. We built the plant at Galena for $139,000 in 1971. We then agreed to buy fish for Whitney Fidalgo for 2 cents a pound. Local fishermen caught the salmon with gill nets and fish wheels and received the local going price. The business grew. At one time, we had 11 boats picking up salmon from fishermen up and down the river from Galena and delivering them to our plant. Powered with big outboard motors, those boats traveled the 55 miles between Nulato and Galena in 1 hour and 20 minutes. Going downriver at 60 miles an hour, they could reach Nulato from Galena in 45 minutes. On the return, they traveled at 45 or 50 miles an hour with loads of from 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of salmon. Within 2 years, we paid off the construction loan on the fish plant. Once we sent 7 full 37 Boeing jets out of Galena in one day. In one summer, we handled 2 million pounds of salmon. We operated 4 years, and in that time we lost to spoilage only one 1,800-pound tote of salmon. Whitney Fidalgo and others who received our fish knew they could depend on receiving a fresh, well-cared-for product. During the last year we operated, we had 92 employees, all Yukon River residents. Each day we airshipped 50,000 pounds of cleaned fish from Galena to Seattle. From there, the fish was transshipped to Norway. The air freight bills were frightening. Once I was in debt to Wien Airlines for $130,000. "That's absurd," I told a Wien accountant. "Every time a plane lands in Anchorage with our fish in it, send me a bill. Don't let my account build like that." "We have to wait until the end of the month," he told me. "Number that won't do," I insisted. Once, for 2 consecutive months, I wrote checks for air freight bills of $180,000. Every time one of those jets came to Galena, it cost $9,000. Sometimes we used Hercules aircraft at a rate of $10,000 per trip. 2 trips were required some days. I once watched a Hercules take off from Galena with her belly loaded with our salmon. It was so heavy the tires looked flat, yet that powerful plane used only half of the 6,000-foot runway as it roared off toward Anchorage, 340 miles distant. Shipping costs went up, and the price we received for handling salmon went down. Our profits dwindled, and the margin was close. Finally, our only profit was from the salmon eggs we sold to Japanese buyers. The eggs are a delicacy in Japan. I nearly killed myself on that salmon business, with round-the-clock operation for 2 months each summer and almost full-time the rest of the year. When a Japanese firm made an offer to buy the plant in 1984, I was happy to sell it. But many local Alaskans lost their summer jobs when I sold, and that worried me, so I looked for other possible business opportunities that could benefit local residents. It suddenly struck me that many people along the Yukon were experts at making fine smoked salmon, and most had sold smoked salmon for years. Even Angela and I had occasionally sold dried king salmon strips, often called woman of the tribe candy. Then one day, the state confiscated some of our salmon strips that had been bought and displayed by a Kotzebue merchant. "The strips don't meet state standards," a state official explained. Suddenly, after years of a profitable sideline for many locals, we were all out of business. "Before you can sell this product, you must have approval from state and federal agencies," an official warned me. That sounded simple, so I started to follow through. Angela and I had a fine big smokehouse and good indoor working space near it. We decided to upgrade these into a government-approved facility, and to get government approval, I started through the bureaucratic maze. I applied for permits, special numbers, and licenses from state and federal agencies. I even had to get a permit to drill for water for my plant. I drove a well 28 feet and got good, pure water. Then a different agency insisted I had to drive my well 6 feet deeper. I followed their instructions. Water quality was no better at 34 feet than it had been at 28 feet, but the requirement had been met, so I was legal. My smokehouse floor was washed gravel. The state required cement. The sheet metal walls of my smokehouse were too loose. Supposedly, they might let in blowflies that could walk on or lay eggs on curing fish. Anyone but a bureaucrat knows flies avoid smoke. I drew plans for a new smokehouse and processing building and submitted them to various agencies. My drawings brought lengthy discussions and new rulings. Patiently, I made the changes they asked for. In addition to buying a business license, I had to post a $10,000 bond to hire help to build it. To buy fish, I had to pay a 3% fish tax in advance or provide a bond to that effect. The plant had to have stainless steel tables with plastic tops on which to cut fish. Sinks had to be stainless steel with hot and cold running water for washing fish. The entire plant had to be insect-proof, including the smokehouse. It required more than a year to get a permit to discharge not more than 500 gallons of water into the Yukon River, and I almost didn't get that permit. I was told that I had to have a 12-foot deep seepage pit to meet the drainage requirements. Frustrated by these standards, I traveled from the lower Yukon River at Marshall to Dawson on the upper Yukon, and found that not one of the dozen or so companies along the river had a seepage pit. I was the only one expected to meet that requirement. All these plants, which were Japanese-owned, were discharging directly into the Yukon River. As an American citizen, I was not permitted to do what aliens were doing. When I pointed this out to some key people in government, I was told I could operate in the same way as the Japanese. After 2 long years of dealing with the bureaucracy, my plans met every requirement of the state and federal agencies. We completed the plant in 1988 for about $70,000 with help from a state grant and started operating it the following year. Most commercial fishermen on the lower Yukon, from Anvik to Ruby, catch chum salmon mainly for their roe, which they sell to Japanese buyers. Many of the fish themselves go to waste. My smoking operation makes use of these waste fish, and our smoked salmon is a fine product that can now be found in grocery stores competing with similar products from Washington State and Canada. It is my hope that other locally owned salmon operations will spring up along the Yukon, using even more parts of each fish by smoking the meat and grinding the livers, hearts, and other organs into a pâté for European markets. I hope to be able to share everything I learned about getting permits and the complex physical requirements for constructing a plant. I would like my plant to be a model for others, serving as a training center for anyone who wants to enter this business. When I moved my family from Hog River to Huslia in the early 1950s, the village had no school. The territory refused to grant money to build a village school, but Bishop William J. Gordon of the Episcopal Church promised $2,000 to pay for the roof, floor, doors, and windows if the villagers would build a log schoolhouse. The men of Huslia built a 30 by 60 log schoolhouse, and that fall the territory furnished a teacher and books. Some of the 24 pupils were 16 or 17, too old, they thought, to be going to school. Edwin Simon and my brother Jimmy persuaded them otherwise. Some families had already moved to their winter traplines, but Edwin and Jimmy rounded them up and convinced them to return to the village to attend school. At the time, they were not required by law to go to school. John Sackett, the half-Koyukon son of trader Jack Sackett, was the first graduate of the new school when he was 19. Later, he was to become an Alaska state senator. When he started school at Huslia, his desk was a wooden gasoline box from Standard Oil Company, and his seat was a round chunk of wood cut from a tree. In the 1950s and after, many Native students left their homes to attend BIA schools at Mount Edgecumbe at Sitka in southeastern Alaska. Others went to Eklutna, where I had gone, or even to Chimawa, a BIA school in Oregon. Whichever school they chose, students lost the guidance and teaching of their parents while they were so far from home. After statehood came in 1959, Alaska's Department of Education gradually assumed the schooling of rural Alaskan children, taking over from the BIA. It was costly to maintain many small schools and villages scattered across Alaska, and state officials decided to centralize education for Alaska's natives by closing many of the rural schools and building dormitories for rural students at Bethel in western Alaska, and in Fairbanks and Anchorage. The children were to live in these dormitories while attending city schools. I served on the Huslia School Board until I moved to Galena in 1963, and there I was a member of the Galena School Board for 25 years. I became a strong advocate of local education for young villagers at least through high school, and I encouraged all youngsters to get as much education as possible beyond that level. I was convinced the dormitories were a bad idea. I wanted to give my own children direct guidance and support from home while they were in high school, which they wouldn't get if they were sent to some distant place for schooling. If you don't like it, why don't you tell the Board of Education in Anchorage? One of the Galena School Board members suggested. I will, I declared in the heat of the moment. In Anchorage, for 3 days, I listened to the State Board of Education. Although representatives from other villages were there, none were speaking out against the plan. The board continued to speak in terms of housing village high school students in Bethel, Anchorage, and Fairbanks. During a recess, I told an elderly woman who was a member of the 7-person board that I opposed their plan. "Why don't you get up and say so?" she encouraged. "I'm not used to interrupting people," I said. "You raise your hand and ask for the floor," she said. "If the chairman doesn't recognize you, I'll object. I'll back you up. That's what this meeting is about." When the session reconvened, I raised my hand. I was ignored and became embarrassed. "This man wants to be heard," said the woman board member in a loud voice. Finally, the chairman of the Board of Education gave me the floor. I walked up front and made my pitch. Schools with dormitories, as you're planning, would be institutions. They would resemble reform schools. The kids living there would have to be under strict discipline, something they have never experienced. Such conditions would create havoc with Indian and Eskimo kids. Kids, even at the high school level, need parental guidance. They need to be close to home. Then I returned to my seat. There was a stunned silence. Suddenly, as if a dam had broken, other voices joined in supporting my view. Many of the Eskimo and Indian people there had been aching to speak, but they were too polite to interrupt the board. In the end, the Commissioner of Education said that this was the kind of response he had wanted. That ended the dormitory proposal. Instead of dormitories, the state built high schools in every village. Some were too small to offer a full range of subjects. This brought on the Molly Hooch court case about 1964, which resulted in a ruling that required the state of Alaska to provide village schools comparable, in every way, to those in urban Alaska. Admittedly, some white elephants resulted, but we had moved in the direction of better education for rural Alaskans. In most interior Alaska villages, books have been learning sources for a relatively short time. Some schools, like the one at Huslia, opened their doors in the mid-1950s or later. The white man's education was new to most Native parents. Gradually, they realized the need and demanded formal education for their children, though sometimes they were uncertain of the reasons. Most Native parents were dollar poor, but rich in their knowledge of Native ways of life and how to survive in the harsh wilderness of the North. Traditionally, parents were the teachers. Their lifelong task was to educate their children in the old ways. Now their children left home daily to learn another way of life in another world, and a vital link was often omitted because the parents were not included in the education process. While busy with their school studies, the children failed to acquire a bush education. But for rural Alaskans, education isn't just book learning. It is also knowing how to build a boat, a fish wheel, a log cabin, or how to set a trap or a snare. It is knowing how to build a fire, how to dress for the cold, how to find your way in the woods. Bush education is my Aunt Josie's skill in removing beaver from a lodge. It is knowing how to be frugal with supplies and how to care for equipment. It is knowing how to dress a moose or a salmon, how to repair a snow machine or an outboard motor, how to shoot a gun. In the past, a bush education was enough. Today, to survive and prosper in rural Alaska, young people need both a bush education and a white man's education. Chapter 25. Reflection. I recently received a fine pocket knife as a gift from a Kobuk Eskimo who is a descendant of the Eskimo trader Chillicothe. I then sent him a present to honor his gift. These gifts are a way of demonstrating that the friendship between the families of my grandfather and the Eskimo trader Chillicothe continues. It is difficult to convey the satisfaction and pleasure that I feel at this continuing, more than a century-old, close relationship. Many Americans think of Alaska as an unpeopled, untouched wilderness. Indian, Eskimo, and Aleut people lived in these wilderness lands for centuries before the first whites arrived, and these original people had complex cultures with ongoing relationships between different groups. These first inhabitants of the region established intelligent relationships with Alaska's wildlands before the dawn of written history. A few paragraphs from a 1982 National Park Service publication, Tracks in the Wildland, a portrayal of Koyukon Nunamut subsistence, by Richard Nelson, Kathleen Mautner, and Ray Bain, speak of Alaska as home to these peoples. To most of us, the vast stretches of forest, tundra, and mountain lands in Alaska constitute a wilderness in the most absolute sense of the word. In our minds, this land is wilderness because it is undisturbed, pristine, lacking in obvious signs of human activity. To us, undisturbed land is unoccupied or unused land. But in fact, most of Alaska is not wilderness, nor has it been for thousands of years. Much of Alaska's apparently untrodden forest and tundra land is thoroughly known by people whose entire lives and cultural ancestry is intimately associated with it. Indeed, to the native inhabitants, these lands are no more an unknown wilderness than are the streets of a city to its residents. The fact that we identify Alaska's remote country as wilderness derives from our inability to conceive of occupying and utilizing land without altering or completely eliminating its natural state. But the Indians and Eskimos have been living this way for thousands of years. Certainly then, theirs has been a successful participation as members of an ecosystem. In a world of environmental degradation, this represents an exemplary form of human adaptation, fostering a healthy coexistence of man and ecosystem. Certainly, we have been incapable of utilizing our land so well. The country is anything but wilderness. At best, it can be called a wildland. In the early 1980s, I decided to try my hand at trapping again after being away from it for 24 years. Lynx furs were bringing from $300 to $700 each. Wonderful prices. Phantom-like, the lynx, Alaska's only wild cat, stands as tall as a Great Dane dog. Gray in color, weighing up to 30 pounds, with long legs, they are rarely seen. Their big feet function like snowshoes and carry them lightly over loose snow. Lynx numbers increase with snowshoe hare abundance, for hares are their primary food. Snowshoe hare abundance is cyclic, with peaks occurring at roughly 10 years. From great abundance, hare numbers may decline to virtually no animals, and lynx numbers follow. Although the lynx is big and strong, even a small trap will usually hold one of these animals, for they don't struggle much when caught. Lynx meat is veal-like, light in color, and mild-flavored, a favorite with many Alaska bush residents. In the spring of 1982, I made a wide sweep, looking for lynx sign in the country across from my salmon fishing camp on the Yukon River, and sign appeared promising. At the time, I thought back to a catch of lynx made before I was born in the early 1900s by old Chief Henry in the Red Mountain country of the Upper Koyukuk. It was the largest catch of lynx that I've ever heard about. "How many you catch?" I once asked Henry. "2 14-foot basket sleds full," he replied without hesitation, for such success is unforgettable. Lynx skins then sold for $1 each at Arctic City. The 2 basket sleds of lynx skins that he delivered to a fur buyer brought him pretty near $300, he told me. It was, he said, the only time he had ever owned a sack of $20 gold coins. At 1980s prices, not considering inflation, Chief Henry's sackful of gold coins would represent less than half the price for one good lynx skin. As I built and outfitted a trapping cabin and bought traps, I was disappointed at how few lynx traps $1,000 bought, and surprised at the changes in equipment and clothing over the decades. Instead of a dog team, I used a snow machine that could easily travel 60 miles per hour if I dared run it that fast. Synthetic fabrics replaced my old Metlicot pure wool underwear. I had an eiderdown sleeping bag rather than the black bearskin sleeping bag I had used as a boy. Despite the advantages of modern equipment, I was reminded that trapping itself is still risky, even for a 67-year-old with a lifetime of experience in the subarctic. I spent early fall at my new camp, cutting wide trails for my snow machine. A narrow trail is plenty for a dog team. I even had to cut out all the fallen logs that lay across the trail. A dog team and sled easily cross such logs, but a snow machine won't. I finished cutting most of the trails a few days before trapping season. On October 28th, the weather turned cold, with a temperature of -30 degrees. I loaded my gear in a plastic sled, which I towed with my snow machine. The sled could double as a boat for crossing a creek, for it floated fairly high and dry. I headed toward 8 Mile Creek, looking at side lakes, watching for a bear den. Throughout the day, before each crossing, I checked ice cautiously at every creek and slough, and found no ice less than 1.5 inches thick, even close to a beaver dam. I could zip right across. As dusk fell, I was eager to reach home. I grew careless and sped the snow machine to about 30 miles per hour to cross a pond by a beaver dam. I ran about 30 feet onto the pond and broke through the ice. With me on it, the snow machine sank to the bottom through splintered ice and floating grass, and the frigid water came to just under my arms. I was soaking wet, alone, and far from shelter. I was in real trouble. My survival hinged on obtaining gear from the sled, reaching shore with it, and quickly lighting a fire. Stepping off the snow machine, I waded back to unhitch the buoyant sled. It floated, holding the back end of the snow machine off the bottom of the pond. I had to plunge my hands more than 2 feet under water to reach the hitch. The cold metal of the hitch at the air temperature of 30 below had instantly turned the water around it to ice. Fumbling, I got my belt knife out of its case and tapped the ice-encrusted hitch until it came free. It was a battle all the way. My arms got soaked to the shoulders, and I soon lost my gloves. Turning toward shore, I knew I must quickly climb out of the water and cross the 60 feet of ice that appeared fairly solid. Pulling the sled, I tried climbing up on the ice and almost succeeded. My soaked clothing seemed to weigh a ton. Just when I was almost on top, the ice broke off, and I submerged. With my hair dripping, I came up cussing. I should have tested the ice with my axe before putting my weight on it. The pond was only about 5 feet deep. I dug out my axe and inched my way along the ice's edge, tapping until I found a stretch that was firm enough to support me. And then I climbed onto the ice. I was growing weak, and the icy water plus the chilly air temperature were bringing me close to hypothermia. I'm lean, without much fat for insulation, so the cold penetrated quickly. Everything I touched, the ice, the sled, the axe, froze to my wet hands, and they started to go numb. I had to cover them, so with my axe I cut the string on my bag from the sled and found gloves. Desperately, I managed to work my stiff, wet fingers into the fur-lined gloves, which sure felt good. Dragging the sled, I trotted across the solid ice to shore, searching for a place suitable for building a fire. I had to have heat, and quickly. I spotted many dry bushes from old beaver cuts and a small dead dry spruce tree about 4 inches in diameter. I chopped the tree down and piled it on some dry brush. My oil-soaked fire starter rags were submerged with the snow machine, but there was a 5-gallon plastic container of gasoline on the sled. Having lost my knife while struggling with the sled hitch, I used my axe to cut the rope across the gas can. My hands were too numb to open the screw top, and after a few tries, I quit wasting time and hacked a hole in the jug with the axe. I couldn't open the marble steel match safe I always carry in my pocket with my stiff fingers, nor could my freezing hands operate the cigarette lighter I carry for starting fires. For emergencies, I carried extra Strike Anywhere matches inside a Ziploc bag in my shirt pocket. I also had a bag of matches in my toolbox and another in a handy bag with my clothes. I pulled the matches out of my shirt pocket, but I couldn't grasp them with my numbed fingers. As the first match dropped in the snow, my tired mind asked, "What the hell now?" I worked 2 matchsticks between my lips, with sulfur tips out, ready for striking. I poured gasoline over the pile of firewood, and moving my head, I swiped a match against the rough-sided marble match safe. The matchstick broke. Would I die because I couldn't even light a match? How long would it be before searchers found my frozen body? After years as a woodsman, would people say that Sidney got careless in his old age and let the country kill him? Memories of men I had known who had frozen to death flashed through my mind. I did not dare break the other match. I was growing lightheaded and clumsy, but I simply had to succeed this time. With clenched teeth, I turned my head carefully, wiping the match against the match safe. It didn't light. Again I turned my head, slightly faster this time, and the match lit. I spit the flaring match onto the gasoline-soaked wood. Whoosh! The gasoline ignited, and the dry wood blazed. I stuck my numb hands out gratefully above the flames, then pulled them back, remembering that I could burn them because they had no feeling. When sensation returned to my hands, I pulled out the waterproof bag holding my sleeping bag and cut the tie string with my axe. Draping the bag over my shoulders, I allowed heat from the leaping flames to reflect from it while I removed my wet, partially frozen clothes. My Thinsulite underwear was wet but not frozen. I had a tough time removing my boots, and in the end had to use the axe to cut the laces. Both feet were beyond being cold. They were numb. I wrapped them in the warm wool sleeping bag liner. As my hands began to come to life, the pain began, but I was able to pull off my Thinsulite drawers and hold them to the fire. They dried in minutes, and when I slipped them back on, they felt wonderful. My Thinsulite undershirt also dried quickly when I held it near the flames. I was pleased to discover this fast-drying trait of synthetic underwear. My old-style wool underwear would have taken hours to dry. My feet began to sting and then to hurt, almost as if I were holding them in the fire. Even the bones seemed to burn. The pain in my feet was much worse than in my hands. The urgency of warming my freezing body made time move slowly, but actually all of this occurred within about 20 minutes. I warmed some dry duofold wool and silk underwear from my clothing bag and pulled it on over the Thinsulite, and the warmth against my skin was most welcome. Out of my clothing bag I dug dry socks and pants. Drying my water-soaked parka would have taken hours, so I didn't even try, but put on my extra jacket, which had a hood, and I snuggled into it. My fingers were now warm enough to work a zipper. Gratefully, I put on my extra moon boots. These insulated rubber-soled boots aren't the easiest to walk in, but they are warm. With dry clothing from head to foot, I felt 100 years younger. Darkness had fallen, and I didn't know how far I was from where the trail crossed the creek, although I figured the distance wasn't more than 2 miles. I didn't want to camp by my fire, although I dreaded walking away from the comforting flames. I drew wolfskin mittens on over my gloves, picked up my axe, and set off, following the creek but staying on high ground. I had had all I wanted of freezing water. I wasn't about to walk on the creek ice. Cutting across the bends of the creek, I trudged through the rough terrain for about 2 hours before hitting my trail. From there, I had to walk about 10 more miles through the portage, across lakes, to my camp on the bank of the Yukon River. I kept moving, never pausing, knowing that a stop could have been my last one. I was dog-tired when I staggered into camp at 5 o'clock the next morning. I built a fire in the stove and crawled into bed. For a few hours, I was dead to the world. When I awoke about midday, I was stiff and sore all over. My neck felt swollen, and I could hardly move my head. I rested all day. The next day, I took a spare snow machine I kept at camp for just such an emergency, and went to retrieve the sunken machine. I managed to attach a line to it, and with a come-along fastened to the spare snow machine, I dragged it from its watery resting place. The poor machine was a big ball of ice when I finally pulled it onto the bank. After many hours, I managed to de-ice it and get it running again. I caught $16,000 worth of furs that winter, the most I ever earned in a year of trapping. 63 lynx, 150 marten, 100 foxes, and 8 wolverine. The least I ever made during a trapping season was $380 during the winter of 1933 to 34, a season I prefer to forget. Although trapping is still a passion for many Koyukon people, unfortunately it is no longer economical to make a living from a trapline. Fur prices haven't risen like prices for other items. In fact, amounts paid for many furs today are not much higher than they were in 1928, and some fur prices are actually much lower. But today, a trap costs 8 times what it did when I was a boy. A $3 boy's axe, handy on a trapline, now costs $28. Gasoline used to cost 42 cents a gallon. Today, we pay $2.50 plus tax. Feeding a dog team with purchased food is prohibitively expensive. Those who own dog teams must catch fish to feed their dogs. Snow machines are more commonly used by trappers now. The average machine sells for around $4,000, and a full season can wear a machine out. Most who trap now do so as a sideline, and some regard trapping as recreation. My early years on the trapline were my poorest times financially, but the richest in satisfaction. Sadly, that old way of life is gone. I love to start my summer day at 5 in the morning. The air is cool and fresh and usually calm. Birds call, and the world seems to have renewed itself overnight. One such morning, I went to my fish wheel on the Yukon River and worked hard to remove a heavy drift log jammed in the wheel. Working alone, I finally yanked it out. I was balanced on the spar log, which anchored the fish wheel to shore, when suddenly I had a terrible pain in my chest. I moved quickly to the beach on the narrow spar. Near shore, I fell. My legs were in the water, but I just lay there, in bad shape. I thought that my problem was lack of breakfast. I was growing numb from the cold water when I crawled out on the bank. The pain slowly diminished. The sun climbed higher, and my clothes dried as I sat enjoying the warmth. Then I finished tending to the fish wheel. Several times that summer I had dizzy spells but thought little of them. When nearing the 70-year mark, a person must expect a few creaks. The following winter, while trapping, I got my snow machine stuck, and while lifting and digging it out, I found myself lying in the snow, recovering consciousness with a hurting chest. Gradually, my heart pains came more often. Over one summer, I built a new home for Angela, figuring that if I died, she would have a decent place to live. Our old house, where we raised so many kids, was too big for her if she was to be alone. As I worked to finish the new house, I had to rest often, allowing my heart to settle down. In 1982, I found myself at Mary's Help Hospital in San Francisco. 3 arteries to my heart were blocked, and I needed a triple bypass operation. With a concerned look, my doctor said, "Sidney, you have about a 50-50 chance of pulling through the surgery." The operation was scheduled for the next morning, but a crisis arose at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the surgical team decided to operate immediately. Before operating, one of the doctors told me that he wanted to consult with Angela and our daughter Agnes, who had accompanied me from Alaska. I asked, "I'm the one you're going to work on, right?" "Yes." "You guys are the engineers. Let's get to work on this thing," I said. "You say I have a 50-50 chance. I've played many a hand of cards with big stakes when the odds weren't that good." Afterward, the doctors told me they had a tough time persuading my heart to start up again after the surgery, and then I sailed through the first critical hour and a half after surgery. One patient I saw in intensive care couldn't handle the stress. He had plugs and drains all over him like I did, and he yanked them all out. Before the doctors and nurses could replace them, he was dead. Rebuilding my strength took a long time, but that summer I was able to build a new house at my fish camp, and I did my usual commercial salmon fishing. So, life goes on. I have a plastic eye, false teeth, 2 hearing aids, and 3 bypasses to my heart. I call myself the modern plastic man. But, modern or not, about 75% of the food we live on still comes from the wildlands along the Yukon and Koyukuk rivers. In these later years, I often think how pleasurable my life with Angela has been. Angela is skilled in many of the old ways. She is always helping people make potlatches, some of which cost thousands of dollars and weeks or months of effort. Both the elders and young Koyukon people also come to her for help in making decisions in their lives. They ask her how to make various garments and how to prepare Indian foods. They use her patterns for fur boots, parkas, mittens. Every year, to make preserves, jams, and jellies, she picks gallons of berries, including wild berries and domestic strawberries and raspberries, which we grow. When we got married, Angela said she wanted 12 babies. She had her 12 and 2 more besides, before doctors convinced her she shouldn't have more. When Andrew, our youngest, was a teenager, the house seemed empty with just one youngster around. So Angela suggested that we should adopt a baby. Not long after, a young woman called to ask if Angela would care for her baby boy while she went to school for a few months. Angela was on the next airplane to pick up the baby. Mark was fun to have around, and we became very attached to him. Eventually, his young unmarried mother allowed us to adopt him. He became our 15th child. Angela is also an expert at making birch bark baskets and has taught the art to all of our youngsters. Now she teaches this traditional skill to our grandchildren, and she spends time at Galena schools as a volunteer, teaching basket making. Give some kids an opportunity, and they grab it. For some years at Galena, I had a dealership selling Polaris and Yamaha snow machines and Mariner outboard motors. My son Roger now owns that business. One spring, a woebegone little Indian boy around 13 years old came to me. I knew that his parents neglected him because they were often drunk. He barely had enough to eat or clothes to wear, but his greatest desire was to own a snow machine, and he told me he wanted to work for me so he could earn one. "Fine," I said. "You come to me every day, and I'll give you a job to do. You keep track of your time. When you have earned enough for a snow machine, I'll see that you get one." That little guy arrived faithfully every day, and each day I assigned him a job, usually pure drudgery. He cleaned boats, shoveled refuse, straightened up a workshop, retrieved parts, and ran errands, helping with our salmon business. He asked me to keep track of his time, but I insisted that he write down his own time. I wanted to show my confidence in his honesty, and I hoped he would see the practical value of arithmetic. By Christmas, he had earned a snow machine. Through this process, he learned the value of work, and so was proud of his new machine and was determined to care for it properly. Today, that young man is married and a sober, hard-working citizen. He made himself what he is. My contribution was small, but I like to think significant. In 1966, a book, On the Edge of Nowhere, by James Huntington, my brother Jimmy, as told to Lawrence Elliott, recounted Jimmy's adventurous life to that date. In that account, the ages of Marion, Jimmy, and me, when our mother died in June 1920, were incorrectly given as 7, 5, and not quite 2. The editors chose not to print our real ages, claiming that readers wouldn't believe the story. To set the record straight, I was born on May 10, 1915, and was 5. Jimmy, born August 14, 1916, was 3, and Marion, born December 2, 1935, was 3/19/18, was a year and a half. In the late 1970s, Jimmy was elected to a 2-year term in the Alaska House of Representatives. After that, Governor Jay Hammond appointed him to the Board of Fisheries, where he served 2 3-year terms. We didn't agree on many issues, for he was inclined to be liberal while I'm generally conservative. But that didn't keep us apart. We sometimes argued, but we respected each other's views. When he was 59, Jimmy had a heart attack while trapping marten in the Hog River country. He lay under a tree for 7 hours before he recuperated enough to get back to his cabin. After resting a few days with the help of one of his sons, he pulled his traps and drove his snow machine all the way to Galena in one day. A hard day's work even for a man in good health. He boarded a plane that evening and flew to Anchorage, and the next morning surgeons performed an emergency heart bypass operation on him. That spring he had his Yukon River fish wheel running. His camp was 6 miles below my fish camp. Every morning during salmon season, at 5 o'clock, sometimes earlier, I went to check my fish wheel 3 miles below Jimmy's place. I'd stop and we'd visit for a moment, or sometimes I'd just wave as I passed, happy to see him out and about. That fall, amazingly, he hunted moose. Annually, he made several trips by boat from Galena to Hog River, hauling fuel for his snow machine, planning to be back trapping in winter. He loved the Hog River country. In March 1987, he fell ill and tried to drive his snow machine to the Galena Medical Clinic. He almost made it, but in great pain he stopped at a friend's house, and his friend got him to the clinic and called me. Jimmy and I talked while waiting for a medevac airplane to arrive from Anchorage. "It's been kind of a bad year for me, Sidney," he said, not complaining, just stating a fact. I told him we had both lived good, clean lives that we could look back on with pride, that I felt we did what God intended for us to do, help make the world better for others. "Sidney, I know. I don't think I'll see you again," he said. The attendant closed the airplane door, and I watched the plane lift into the darkening sky. Jimmy died 5 minutes after takeoff. In the summer of 1987, a reunion was held at Anvik Mission to celebrate the 100th anniversary of its founding. I attended that reunion and treasured meeting again with 92-year-old Henry Chapman. It was my pleasure to thank him for making a home for me as a sad 5-year-old in 1920. At the reunion, I found the grave of Homer Collins, my childhood friend. Tears came as I stood by the grave and remembered my dear friend, gone for all of those 67 years. My grandfather, the trader, was probably born about 1850, perhaps earlier. That's about a decade after the first Russians arrived at Nulato. I was born 10 years after my grandfather's death. Thus only 2 lifetimes, although mine hasn't ended yet, plus 20 years span the period since first contact with whites in Koyukon Indian country. At Galena, I live in a modern house with electricity and all that goes with it, including television, telephone, automatic heat, and hot and cold running water. My grandfather saw many changes in his life, but I'm sure he never dreamed of anything quite like my comforts. The Koyukon people no longer must roam, searching for better hunting and fishing. They live in permanent homes with conveniences and have good medical care. Few babies die, and starvation is no longer a danger. Medicine men no longer dominate their lives. The people still depend upon the land for most of their food, but that food, the fish and game, is abundant. But the number of Koyukon people along the Koyukuk and Lower Yukon is about the same as when my grandfather was alive. And he would recognize the Koyukuk Valley if he could see it today, for it hasn't changed much. The summer sun circles endlessly, and clean white snow blankets the land every winter. Spire-topped spruces still dominate the forests, and the white birch trees still shine in the winter moonlight. And through it all, the Koyukuk River still flows clear above Hughes and slightly murky below.